You settle into the stillness as the story begins, the way a listener long ago may have leaned closer to a hearthfire as night slowed the world. There were many unsettling tales in medieval towns and villages, but this one began with a whisper, not a true whisper of course, but an idea that moved from mouth to mouth, from farmstead to cottage, carried by fear rather than sound. They called it the Whispering Plague, long before they knew what it truly was, and the name itself carried a strange calm that did not match the reality of what moved so quietly through the countryside. You can picture the world in which this story lived. Narrow earthen lanes pressed between timbered houses, the pale scent of smoke in the air from low fires that never fully warmed the chill, the sound of wooden wheels crossing worn ruts. This was a place where daily life moved slowly, evenly, and sometimes without note. In that world, sickness was a familiar visitor, yet this one felt different to the people who first noticed it. It came without warning, without messenger, and without the loud symptoms they were used to. There were no fevers at the start, no sweats, no crimson blotches to warn them. The first accounts speak of a farmer in the southern region of a small kingdom, whose name is mostly lost to time. He had spent a long day repairing the thatch on his roof, pausing only to tend to his animals, who moved with their usual gentle rhythm. When he returned indoors that evening, he felt nothing unusual. He ate his simple meal, a bowl of barley porridge with herbs, and went to sleep. It was the next day, as he walked along the field boundary, that he felt a slight weakness in his legs. They describe it later as faintness, a sense that the ground pulled in small ways at his feet. No pain, no cough, only a subtle heaviness of the limbs. The villagers believed it to be fatigue. Most things were fatigue in that time. After all, life required constant labor. They had no reason to think a plague had begun its quiet walk among them. For several days, the weakness remained mild. The farmer continued his work, though he worked more slowly. When he finally spoke of it to a neighbor, he admitted he felt the strange sense that something was pressing on him from the inside, like a soft hand against the bones. Not enough to stop him, only enough to unsettle him. Then the neighbor mentioned that he had felt something similar for 2 days. It was a tiredness he could not shrug off, even after long sleep. When more villagers spoke of the same sensation, they still did not imagine a plague. They believed it was an early cold season settling into their muscles. Their animals were healthy, their children laughed and played, no one looked ill. Yet word traveled from one settlement to the next, and it soon became clear that this strange weakness was not isolated. Travelers brought similar accounts from villages several miles away. People there had felt the same creeping discomfort. They described it as a whisper under the skin, a soft movement that made them uneasy but did not stop their daily tasks. This was what frightened the elders most. Illness was expected to show itself loudly. They were used to sudden chills or visible marks or violent coughs. This quiet ailment confused them. You imagine the council meetings in those villages. A handful of older men and women sitting in a cold hall with a rush-covered floor, looking at one another with a mix of doubt and concern. They had lived through outbreaks of pox and camp fever. They had seen wounds turn black with rot. A sickness without clear signs felt unnatural. They wondered what this thing wanted, though they did not express the thought aloud. By the 3rd week, the whispering plague grew stronger, but still not outwardly dramatic. People began to have trouble lifting sacks of grain they once carried easily. They struggled to climb the gentle slope to the grazing fields. They rested more often, sometimes twice as long as before. Even then, no one died. That was what made them hopeful, and that was what delayed their understanding. When winter approached, the affliction worsened. The weakness deepened into aching. It spread through the limbs until even ordinary tasks required effort. They felt as if their muscles were slowly tightening, drawing inwards. Some began to walk with a slight stiffness. It is easy to imagine how fear would have grown in the quiet corners of their minds. They likely tried herbal remedies, infusions of willow bark for strength, heated stones wrapped in cloth to ease the muscles, steam from boiled mint, but nothing stopped the slow advancement of the illness. What made this plague especially unsettling was its uneven pace. Some villagers recovered almost as soon as the symptoms appeared, while others progressed to greater discomfort. The elders kept careful track of who became ill and who did not. They noticed something curious. Those who spent long days outdoors seemed to fare better than those who worked mostly in small enclosed rooms. At the time, they did not understand that air quality and ventilation could influence the spread of illness, but they sensed patterns. Children remained mostly unharmed. Though a few complained of tired legs at night, adults between their 20s and their 60s suffered the most. Older villagers, surprisingly, experienced the symptoms only lightly, as if the illness passed around them without stopping. This unusual pattern sparked whispers of its own. Some believed the sickness avoided those who had already lived full lives. Others thought the elders had developed a natural resistance from surviving earlier outbreaks. The truth, though unknown to them, likely had more to do with the pacing of work and exposure to enclosed spaces. What transformed this quiet unease into a true urban legend was the arrival of a traveling monk. He came from a monastery several days away and carried with him stories from towns farther south. His order had taken careful notes on the strange malady. He had heard of dozens of villages that reported the same creeping weakness, the same stiffness in the limbs, the same slow advance. But he brought with him one piece of information no one expected. In one town he had visited, physicians had performed basic examinations on those afflicted. They found that many had signs of minor exposure to ergot, a fungus that contaminated stored grain when the weather turned damp and cool. This fungus, when consumed in small amounts, could cause hallucinations, numbness, and muscular discomfort. When consumed in larger amounts, it could cause more severe symptoms. At very low levels, however, it produced subtle effects that could easily pass unnoticed. The villagers who heard the monk were astonished. A sickness that came from the very grain they harvested felt like a betrayal. They relied on those stores to survive the winter. The thought that their food might be carrying the sickness troubled them in a deeper way than any ordinary illness. Yet, the monk cautioned them. He said the truth was not certain. The physicians themselves were unsure. Some villages with ergot in their grain had no cases of the whispering plague, while some villages without contaminated grain had many cases. This inconsistency only deepened the mystery. If ergot was not the sole cause, then what else was at work? People began to inspect their grain more carefully. They spread it out in the light, searching for the telltale dark kernels. They removed the suspicious pieces and burned them. They sifted their flour. They cleaned their storage barns. Still, the illness continued its slow march. In the midst of confusion, an elder woman from the northern part of the village suggested that perhaps the illness came not from the grain itself, but from the enclosed spaces where grain was stored, dust, mold, the lingering air. They dismissed her at first, for such ideas seemed too simple, but her thought lingered. No one in that time understood the nature of airborne spores or their subtle effects. They did not understand how long-lasting exposure could produce gradual, creeping symptoms. Yet they sensed enough to wonder. By the end of winter, the whispers about the plague grew louder, not because the disease became more deadly, but because its origin continued to elude them. How could something so quiet, so subtle, move through so many lives with such persistence? You may wonder what the villagers truly feared. Was it the illness itself, or the uncertainty surrounding it? Was it the weakness in their limbs, or the realization that something hidden and unseen could alter their bodies without warning? And here we pause for a moment, with the villagers standing in a cold barn, staring at their grain as if waiting for answers to rise from it. The cold season is nearly ended, but the mystery of the whispering plague remains. The cold season loosened its grip slowly, the way it often did in the medieval countryside. The light returned first, stretching itself over the fields in faint pale lines. Then came the gradual softening of the frozen paths, followed by the mild scent of thawed earth. Yet while the world around the villagers shifted toward warmth, the illness that had settled in their limbs remained. Some felt it begin to ease, while others sensed it tightening around them with equal measure. Life resumed its ordinary flow, but the plague kept its slow and steady imprint. You can imagine people rising in the early morning, stepping from their beds with the familiar stiffness that greeted them now, as surely as dawn itself. They did not yet understand that their symptoms might have been shaped by the long winter spent in enclosed rooms heavy with smoke and stored grain dust. All they knew was that their bodies felt different than they had the year before. The traveling monk, who had brought tales of the sickness, lingered in the village longer than he intended. His presence provided a sort of quiet reassurance. People approached him cautiously, asking whether neighboring towns had recovered, whether their children were safe, whether the strange affliction would pass with the change of seasons. He had no certain answers, but he listened to their concerns with patience. In that age, a listening ear carried healing of its own, even when it could not cure the body. As the thaw progressed, the villagers began preparing their fields for planting. This was one of the most demanding tasks of the year, and it offered a kind of natural test. Those who had suffered only lightly from the whispering plague found themselves able to resume their work with only a small strain. Those who had suffered more deeply struggled. One farmer, a man named Farron, discovered that each time he tried to lift a tool, the muscles in his arms trembled. He set his spade down repeatedly, rubbing his hands together as though warmth alone could restore his strength. His neighbor, a woman named Alice, had a similar experience. She walked the field with steady steps, but any attempt to bend or turn caused a deep ache that made her pause. Still, they worked. In their world, work was not optional. Work created food, and food meant survival. The villagers pushed through their discomfort with the quiet endurance that defined their lives. Meanwhile, the council continued its observations. They noted that those who spent long hours outdoors felt modest improvement. The air seemed to ease their symptoms. Those who remained indoors, especially in poorly ventilated cottages, often worsened. This encouraged more villagers to take their tasks outside whenever possible. Looms were moved closer to open doorways. Spinning wheels were carried to the thresholds. Even cooking pots were set near windows to let the smoke escape. At the same time, the villagers began speaking more openly about the illness. People who once kept their concerns quiet now compared their experiences in detail. They described odd tingling sensations in the hands, sudden waves of fatigue, and an intermittent tightening in the legs. Someone mentioned that he sometimes felt a faint buzzing under the skin, as though tiny creatures were moving inside him. Others nodded in recognition, though they disliked imagining anything alive within their bodies. Discussions like these became frequent near the well, on the path to the fields, and during the slow hours of market day. Despite the rising openness, fear still lingered. You might imagine that fear as a shadow moving along the edges of everyday life. It did not interrupt their routines, but it hovered in their thoughts. They wondered how long the illness intended to stay. They wondered whether it would fade on its own, or whether something hidden in their environment continued to feed it. In time, small clues began to emerge. A group of young men clearing out an old granary found large clusters of darkened grain lodged deep in the corners. These pieces were clearly spoiled. When they brought the findings to the council, the elders examined the grain with suspicion. They had heard the monk mention that physicians believed ergot contamination played a role in some regions. Now they wondered whether their own grain stores held similar dangers. The elders decided to burn the spoiled grain at once. Several villagers gathered around the fire, watching the kernels crack and blacken. They hoped this symbolic act would bring relief. Yet even as the smoke rose into the cool spring air, they knew that burning a single bundle of grain could not unravel the larger mystery. That night, the council held a meeting. You can picture them sitting around a rough wooden table. Speaking in low and steady voices, they discussed every known detail. Some insisted the illness must be a lingering winter ailment. Others argued that the symptoms were too unusual. The monk offered his memories of similar scenes in other towns. Some of those towns had improved with the warmer weather. Some had not. In the middle of the meeting, one elder raised a thoughtful point. Perhaps the plague was not a single illness at all. Perhaps it was a combination of several small influences that had gathered over the course of the winter. Poor air, mold on the walls, dust from the granaries, mild nutritional deficiencies, and the constant strain of winter labor might have worked together to produce something that felt larger than the sum of its parts. It was a practical suggestion, even though the villagers lacked the scientific knowledge to confirm it. Their understanding of health was rooted in observation and instinct. They trusted patterns, even when the reasons behind those patterns remained unclear. The following day, the elders encouraged everyone to open the shutters early, to let sunlight sweep through the rooms. They urged families to remove old sacks from their storage spaces and clean the corners where moisture collected. These were simple tasks, but they represented a shift. For the first time, the villagers felt they could do something active to defend themselves against the whispering plague, even if the disease remained stubbornly silent. Some improvement followed, not dramatic, but enough for people to notice. Those who cleaned their homes and spent more time outdoors reported lighter symptoms. Those who ignored the suggestions or who lacked the strength to carry them out often saw little change. The connection was not perfect, but it was enough to fuel hope. As spring unfolded into full growth, travelers resumed their journeys through the region. They brought their own accounts of the illness. Some villages to the south had recovered nearly completely. In others, the sickness had taken a more severe turn. The villagers heard with dismay that a town far to the east had experienced cases in which the weakness intensified until the afflicted could barely walk. That news struck them deeply. They wondered whether their own situation might worsen with time. The monk listened to these reports with care. One evening, as he spoke privately with the elders, he mentioned another possibility that had circulated among the more learned circles he had visited. Some scholars speculated that the whispering plague was not a single disease, nor a combination of small ailments, but rather a seasonal pattern of poisoning caused by damp weather that affected stored food in many regions at once. This theory had not been proven, but the idea captured the attention of those who heard it. The villagers began examining their food more carefully, not just the grain but dried fruits, cured meats, and stored vegetables. They noticed that some had developed odd smells or unusual textures. Families discarded these items when possible, though wasting food was a source of great discomfort in an era when hunger was always close. Gradually, with improved air circulation, cleaner storage rooms, and the natural shift of the seasons, many people began to regain strength. They did not recover overnight, but each week brought small changes. They could lift tools more easily. They could walk longer distances. The weight that had settled in their limbs seemed to loosen. Still, not everyone improved. A small number continued to feel the deep ache, even as the weather warmed. These individuals puzzled the council. Why did the illness cling to them while releasing others? You might imagine their frustration, watching neighbors return to full health while they remained bound to weakness. They wondered whether something unique in their bodies made them more vulnerable. They wondered whether the illness had left a permanent mark that would shape the rest of their lives. Among them was a man named Corbin. He had once been known for his strength, able to carry heavy timber beams without strain. Now he struggled to lift even modest loads. He visited the monk often, not seeking a cure, but seeking understanding. The monk, for his part, admitted gently that some illnesses did not retreat fully. Sometimes the body healed partially, leaving behind a memory of the affliction that never entirely faded. Corbin carried this thought with quiet resignation. He continued to perform his work, though at a slower pace. His neighbors helped him when they could, and he accepted their assistance with humility. By late spring, the villagers believed they had finally moved past the worst of the whispering plague. They did not declare victory aloud, for they had learned not to speak too confidently about matters of health, but they allowed themselves cautious optimism. They returned to their usual routines, repairing fences, tending livestock, cleaning tools, and preparing for summer gatherings. The illness became a topic of reflection rather than daily fear. Yet one question lingered in their thoughts. They had endured the strange affliction for nearly an entire season, and still they did not know its true cause with certainty. It had crept through their lives quietly, leaving behind more questions than answers. They wondered whether it would ever return, or whether it had been a once-in-a-lifetime event shaped by conditions that might never appear again. You may find yourself wondering the same thing as the villagers did then. If an illness could arrive in such a silent and uncertain way, carried perhaps by grain, or air, or dampness, or long winter confinement, what might it have revealed about the hidden forces that shaped their world? And so we reach another pause, standing with them in the warming light of spring, with the whispering plague fading behind them but never fully explained. They wait for clarity, uncertain whether understanding will ever come. Summer arrived with a quiet certainty, soft and warm, settling itself across the countryside, like a blanket laid neatly over the land. The days were longer now, and the sun drifted lazily across the sky, as though it had nowhere urgent to be. With the change in season came a renewed sense of steadiness among the villagers. Their fields had begun to green, their livestock moved with calm rhythms, and the air carried the scent of new growth. Yet even in this season of abundance, the memory of the whispering plague rested in their minds the way a faint mark remains on a wall long after the object that made it has been removed. Most of the villagers had recovered by this time. Their limbs felt lighter, their steps more certain, and the heaviness that once clung to them seemed to dissolve in the warmth. They were grateful for this, even if they did not speak openly of it. In their world, gratitude was a quiet thing. It lived in the way they worked, the way they shared tasks, the way they treated one another with renewed patience after months of uncertainty. Yet, as you stand with them in imagination, you can sense that the villagers were not entirely free of concern. They had learned too much over the past season to return fully to the unthinking confidence of earlier years. They understood now that strange forces could enter their lives without warning. They had witnessed the way a sickness could move silently through their homes, leaving no clear trace of its path. They wondered whether such illnesses had passed through their villages before without notice, or whether the whispering plague was something new, a sign of changing times or shifting climates. The council continued to discuss the matter, long after the visible danger had passed. They met in the warm evenings, sitting outside the hall, where the air was easier to breathe. They reviewed every detail they had observed during the long winter and early spring. They spoke of the people who had recovered quickly, the people who had required more time, and the few who still felt lingering weakness. One of the most persistent questions concerned those who had not fully healed. Corbin, the timber worker, remained the most visible example. Though his strength had improved, a subtle stiffness continued to follow him. He could work, but not with the speed or ease he once possessed. This puzzled the council. Nothing in his habits seemed unusual. He ate the same food as everyone else, worked in the same fields, and lived in a well-ventilated cottage. Yet something had affected him more strongly than others. The council wondered whether individuals responded differently to the unknown cause of the illness. They considered whether some people were simply more vulnerable, or whether small differences in lifestyle or diet might have played a role. Though they lacked the language of modern science, their instincts led them toward reasonable possibilities. In their discussions, the monk often joined them. He listened carefully, sometimes offering observations drawn from the monasteries and villages he had visited. He reminded them that in his travels he had seen similar patterns. In some towns, a few individuals remained weak for many months after the illness subsided. In others, the symptoms returned in waves, rising and falling with the seasons. This idea unsettled the villagers. The thought that the illness might return, even after so many had recovered, weighed heavily on their minds. But the monk also offered reassurance. He explained that in many places, once the warm season arrived, the illness faded completely, and did not return the following year. Those who remained weak eventually adapted, finding new ways to complete their tasks. Their communities adjusted alongside them. This gave the council a measure of peace, though the uncertainty lingered. The villagers continued to clean and maintain their storage spaces with new diligence. They brushed away dust, scrubbed wooden boards, and opened their shutters daily. The old habits of keeping rooms tightly closed had softened. They found themselves drawn to fresh air in a way they had never been before. Even the elders, who often preferred the comfort of enclosed spaces, now sat near open doorways as they worked. The farmers also changed their methods for storing grain. Instead of packing it so tightly into deep corners, they spread the kernels more evenly, allowing air to reach them. They inspected their stores regularly, checking for discoloration. When they found darkened kernels, they removed them without hesitation. Though they had no definitive proof that spoiled grain caused the illness, the memory of the monk's warning shaped their behavior, subtle but steady. As summer deepened, the village received a visitor who brought new insight to their mystery. He was an older physician, traveling from a distant town to gather herbs and observe regional ailments. Word of the whispering plague had reached him months earlier, and he wished to see the place where it had taken root. His arrival was simple, marked only by the steady sound of his feet on the road and the pack he carried filled with notes and dried plants. The villagers greeted him with cautious hope. The council shared their records with him, telling him everything they had observed. The physician listened quietly, his eyes moving across the room as though searching for unseen patterns. When they finished, he offered his thoughts. He believed the illness was likely caused by a mixture of factors. He explained that in many parts of the region, harsh winters created conditions that were difficult for the body. People spent long hours in confined spaces, breathing air filled with smoke, dust, and the scent of stored crops. These conditions could weaken the body, making it more vulnerable to minor irritants or faint poisons. When the season lasted longer than usual, the effects accumulated. The result was an ailment that crept slowly through communities, affecting each person differently. Though the physician admitted that ergot might have played some role, he emphasized that it was unlikely to be the sole cause. He had seen ergot poisoning before, and its effects were often more dramatic. Yet the whispering plague had moved with greater subtlety. He suggested that the illness might have been a combined result of confined living, mild nutritional deficiencies, and the naturally damp conditions that crept into homes during the cold months. The villagers found this explanation both comforting and frustrating. It reassured them that the illness was not an invisible curse or a punishment. Yet it left them without a single clear cause to address. They realized that the disease had no single enemy they could name or defeat. It was the product of many quiet forces acting together, slipping into their lives unnoticed. You can imagine how this realization shaped their thoughts. In an age when certainty was rare, they found themselves living with a greater acceptance of the unknown. They learned to pay attention to the small details of their environment, to notice dampness where they once ignored it, to value fresh air more than before, and to take note of how their bodies responded to the rhythms of the seasons. By late summer, the physician prepared to leave. Before he departed, he spoke with Corbin, offering him simple exercises and herbal treatments to strengthen his limbs. He told Corbin that persistence often restored what illness had taken, even if the process was slow. Corbin listened with quiet gratitude, believing that the illness had chosen him for reasons he would never fully know. Yet he did not resent it. He accepted this change in himself the way villagers accepted shifts in weather, adjusting their lives as necessary. When the physician walked down the road and disappeared from view, the village felt a subtle closing of a chapter. They had endured the whispering plague, learned from it, and moved through it. It did not leave them unchanged, but neither had it destroyed them. Their community had adapted with the same steady determination that marked all of their struggles. As the year continued, the illness did not return. The villagers began to trust that it had passed. They built their routines around new habits that promoted health, without speaking of them as cures. They simply became part of daily life, woven into their understanding of how to care for themselves and their homes. Yet, the memory remained, soft but persistent. People told the story in quiet tones, passing it from one generation to the next. It became an account of a season when a strange, nearly silent force moved through their limbs and lives, leaving them uncertain of its nature. They spoke of the winter when their bodies felt heavy, the spring when they cleaned every corner of their homes, and the summer when sunlight finally returned strength to their limbs. You may find yourself wondering, as those villagers once did, whether the true cause of the whispering plague will ever be known. Was it one thing alone, or many small things acting together in a way that slipped beyond their understanding? And if the illness came once, quietly and without warning, could something just as subtle ever return in a form they or we might not recognize? These questions drift through time like faint echoes, reminders of how easily hidden forces can touch the lives of even the most ordinary people. The wind rises first, long before the bells of St. Harold begin their slow midnight tolling. It glides across the marshland like a creature hunting its way home, stirring reeds and rippling the surface of the stagnant pools that stretch north of the priory walls. Those who have lived their lives within sight of that old fortress church know that such wind is rarely just wind. They speak of it with a lowered voice, as though it carries a mind of its own. They call it the breath of the night watcher. Our story begins on a chill autumn evening, in the early years of the 14th century, when the village surrounding St. Harold Priory was little more than a clustered handful of timber huts and smoke pits. The villagers feared many things in those days. They feared wolves that came down from the forests. They feared the slow hunger that followed a bad harvest. They feared the baron's tax riders, who often took the last crust of bread off a poor family's table. But above all, they feared the Watcher. The earliest tales warned of a cloaked presence seen pacing the marsh paths after dusk. Sometimes it was said to walk upon the water as though the murky pools were solid earth. Sometimes it was described as a tall man wrapped in robes that fluttered, although there was no breeze. At other times, villagers swore it had no shape at all, only a pair of pale lights drifting above the ground like two floating embers. Most believed the Watcher to be a spirit. Others whispered that it was one of the old monks of St. Harold, a man who had vanished many winters earlier, and whose body had never been found. There were darker tales still. Some said it was a penitent soul, cursed to roam the marsh until the end of time. Some claimed it sought travelers who wandered the wrong road at night, luring them toward the pools where the earth became nothing but sucking mud beneath the water. Yet no one in the village had ever seen the Watcher up close, not until the events that unfolded on the night this section recounts. Astride the central road, beneath a sky full of pale cloud that swallowed the moon, Brother Renfis of St. Harold hurried through the cold toward the village. His lantern swung at his side, its weak flame offering more comfort than illumination. Renfis was no young man. His joints creaked from years of kneeling on flagstone floors and lifting heavy jars of salve for the infirmary, but he carried himself with purpose, for his task that night was not a small one. The priory had suffered 3 strange disruptions in as many weeks. A set of carved stones had been found rearranged around the chapel door, as though laid in some intentional pattern. The sheep kept in the priory's pastures had been discovered huddled at the farthest corner of their field, bleating in frantic distress at dawn. And 2 nights earlier, something had knocked at the infirmary shutters with such force that the old timber cracked. The brothers, devout though they were, had not been able to ignore the rising fear in their hearts. They had prayed, fasted, and sought guidance in Scripture. But Scripture did not speak of marsh spirits. Renfis was the one chosen to visit the village wise woman for counsel. Her name was Ernhild. No one knew her exact age, only that she had lived long enough to see 3 barons rise and fall, and had outlived all her kin. She dwelled in a small thatched hut at the marsh's edge, a place most villagers avoided. They muttered that she trafficked in herbs that could heal or harm, depending on her mood. Despite these rumors, the priory had turned to her before. Ernhild was the only one who understood the old marshland, and Renfis had not forgotten how her remedies had once saved his life after a winter sickness nearly carried him away. He followed the winding path toward her hut, the sound of frogs echoing from the pools on either side. The wind pressed against his cloak, bringing with it the salt-sweet scent of the reed beds and something else. Something iron-like, something bitter. Renfis stopped. A shape moved ahead of him. It was only a flicker at first, a smudge within the darkness, but then the lantern's pale glow struck the air, revealing the outline of a tall, hooded figure standing in the center of the path. Renfis's breath caught in his throat. His chest tightened until he felt the beat of his heart against his ribs. It stood utterly still. The marsh went silent around them, as though even the night creatures dared not break whatever moment this was. Renfis took a slow breath. He felt the weight of the wooden cross at his belt, though his fingers did not yet reach for it. The stories of the Watcher crept into his mind like cold fog. He lifted the lantern, the small flame trembling as much as his hand. "Who walks ahead?" Renfis called, though his voice barely carried above a hoarse whisper. The figure did not move. He stepped closer. A single pace. Another. With every step, the shape seemed to shift, not in movement but in form, as though its edges blurred and sharpened unpredictably. He took one final step, and the lantern light reached the figure fully. There was no face beneath the hooded shadow, no glimmer of eyes, no contour of a nose or cheek. Only darkness, a deep, cavernous darkness, like the mouth of a tunnel cut straight through the world. Renfis froze. He could feel something pulling at him, not physically but inwardly, as though part of his being was drawn toward that empty space. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned. It did not walk. It glided. Its feet never touched the ground. Its cloak did not rustle or drag. It seemed to hover at Renfis's eye level, moving with disturbing smoothness over the reeds. Within a breath, it vanished into the marsh. The wind returned. The frogs croaked again. The distant night stirred as though nothing strange had happened at all. But Renfis knew. Something had changed. The Watcher had revealed itself to him, and the old tales said that once it revealed itself, it never left its witness untouched. He stood trembling for a long time before he could convince his legs to move again. Ernhild Sip's hut lay only a few dozen paces ahead. He reached the door and knocked. The heavy wood creaked open at once, as if Ernhild had been waiting for him. The old woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl of woven reeds and dyed cloth. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes, sharp and amber like a marsh cat's, glinted in the lantern light. "Brother Renfis," she croaked softly, "you have seen it at last." Renfis could not speak. She stepped aside to let him in. Within the hut, herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and dried willow bark. Clay jars lined the shelves. A low fire crackled in a stone hearth. Ernhild motioned for him to sit. "You are pale," she murmured, dropping a pinch of dry leaves into a steaming cup. "Tell me what passed." Renfis struggled to form words. His voice felt unfamiliar in his own throat. "I saw a figure," he whispered. "Hooded, tall, standing in the path. No face, no eyes." Ernhild nodded slowly. "And when it left," Renfis continued, "it did not walk. It floated." The wise woman did not seem startled. She stirred the cup once, twice, then pushed it toward him. "You saw the Watcher," she said. Renfis swallowed hard. Even hearing the name spoken aloud made him shudder. "Why now?" he asked. "Why reveal itself to me?" Ernhild lowered herself to sit across from him. For the first time since he arrived, he noticed a shadow passing over her expression, as though she was weighing something deeply. "The Watcher guards the old boundaries," she said. "The ones your priory was built upon. Long before the church stood there, these marshes belonged to a people who kept ancient oaths. When those oaths were broken, something was left behind." Renfis leaned forward. What was left? Ernild took a long breath. A sentinel, she said softly. A guardian of the forgotten. And it stirs only when the balance is failing. Renfis felt the blood drain from his face. Balance, he repeated. The disturbances at the priory, the stones moved, the livestock terrified, the pounding at the infirmary shutters. Yes, she said. The Watcher is warning you. Something hidden has awakened. Renfis gripped the edge of the table. His hands trembled. What must we do? Ernild hesitated. She looked toward the narrow window, as though checking whether something unseen listened from outside. Finally she spoke. There is one thing you must find, she whispered. Something the Watchers of old buried near the priory long before your order arrived. Something that binds the marsh and the priory together. Renfis leaned forward even more. What is it? He asked. Ernild Sip's eyes narrowed. A relic, she murmured. A relic so ancient that even I do not know its true form, but the Watcher knows. And now that it has shown itself to you, it will not hide again. Renfis stared at her. Where do I begin? He asked, his voice hollow. Ernild reached across the table to grip his wrist with surprising strength. You begin, she said, by understanding this one truth. She held his gaze, her voice dropping to a whisper. The Watcher appears not to frighten, but to warn, and those who ignore its warnings never see another dawn. The fire within Ernild's hearth crackled steadily as Brother Renfis sat frozen in the dim hut, the wise woman's final words echoing in his mind. The relic, the forgotten oath, the Watcher that appeared not as an enemy, but as a messenger of some old balance now threatened. Renfis had always lived his life with quiet devotion. His calling to the priory came in his 30s, in the season when many men settled into farms or trade. He had chosen a different path, one of discipline and service. Yet, in all his years at St. Havold, he had never felt the tremor of fear that now rippled through him. What does the relic guard? He asked. At last, his voice a thin thread of sound. Ernild did not answer immediately. She rose from her stool with slow, deliberate movements, and reached for a small wooden coffer hidden beneath a cloth on the far shelf. The coffer was carved with spirals and knotwork, the kind Renfis had only seen in artifacts far older than the priory. She set it between them. This belonged to my grandmother, she said, and hers before her, as far back as any of my line remembers. It contains the only clues we have of what lies beneath St. Havold. Renfis leaned in cautiously. Ernild lifted the lid. Inside lay a single wrapped bundle of linen, yellowed with age. When she unwrapped it, the cloth revealed a thin tablet of smooth black stone. Carvings etched its surface in a style Renfis did not recognize. Not runes, not script, shapes instead. Circles intersecting lines, a pattern that almost seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. It is said, Ernild murmured, that these markings mirror the burial place of the relic, but no one alive knows how to read them. Renfis studied the stone, but something in the shapes prickled the edges of his senses, as if his mind resisted focusing upon them for too long. Where did this tablet come from? He whispered. From before the priory stood, she answered. Before the barony, before the marsh, drained enough to cradle a settlement. It survived the old tribes who tended this land, tribes who believed that the world was bound by living guardians. The Watcher is the last remnant of their vows. Renfis exhaled slowly. What happens if the relic is not found? He asked. What danger have we awakened? Ernild's gaze drifted to the window where the marsh winds pressed against the shutters. When the balance fails, the marsh does not swallow alone, she said. It spreads. It reaches for what was taken from it. The land turns against those who dwell upon it. Renfis felt his stomach twist. Then I must find it, he said quietly, for the sake of the brothers, for the villagers. Ernild nodded. You must begin with the priory foundation. Look for any place where stone does not match stone, where water seeps though no rain has fallen, where the earth feels colder than the rest. Renfis rose slowly. I will return with what I find, he said. Ernild shook her head. You will return, if the Watcher allows you to, she answered. For now it guides you, but its patience is thin when danger draws near. The walk back toward the priory felt longer than the walk out. The marsh wind pressed harder against Renfis' cloak. The lantern flame danced with restless energy, as though struggling to survive the dark that crept around him. Renfis kept his eyes forward. He did not dare glance aside into the tall reeds where shadows might move without footsteps. He tried not to think of the figure he had seen hovering in the path earlier that night. He tried not to imagine it gliding silently beside him. The bells of St. Harold came faintly into hearing, a comfort that washed over him with warmth. He increased his pace. As he passed the final bend of the marsh road, the priory walls emerged through the mist. Torches burned near the gate, casting a mellow glow across the main courtyard, yet something felt wrong. The sheepfold near the entrance was empty. Renfis frowned. The brothers always brought the animals inside their enclosure, well before nightfall. He quickened his steps and reached the gatehouse where Brother Celian stood holding a staff and small torch. "Renfis," Celian said, startled. "We feared something had happened." Renfis nodded stiffly. "Where are the sheep?" he asked. Celian shifted uneasily. "They broke free at sundown. All of them. They rammed the gate until the latch broke, then ran into the outer fields. We have never seen them behave so wildly." Renfis' heart sank. "Any other disturbances?" Celian hesitated before lowering his voice. "The stable horses refused to drink from their trough. They trembled as if sensing a wolf near, and one of the boys swears he heard something walking on the cloister roof. The Watcher, the warning, the relic." Renfis rubbed the chill from his arms. "I must examine the priory grounds," he said. "Continue your watch." Celian nodded, though uncertainty clouded his expression. Renfis crossed the courtyard toward the chapel. The moon, hidden earlier behind thick clouds, now pushed dim light across the stone walls. He walked in long strides, scanning for anything that Ernild's clues might reveal. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The stones of the chapel stood solid as they had for generations. The infirmary roof was intact, despite the pounding that had cracked the shutters days earlier. The cloister walkway lay quiet. But as Renfis moved toward the northern corner of the priory, he felt a sudden shift in the air. A strange cold radiated up through the ground. He knelt, touching the earth. Though the rest of the soil felt firm and chilled by the night air, this patch felt almost icy, as though frost clung to its depths, despite the season. He stood. His lantern flickered. A faint sound whispered behind him. Renfis turned sharply. Nothing. Only the silent cloister yard. He took a cautious step toward the corner of the foundation wall. The stones here differed from the rest. Most of St. Harold had been built of light-colored quarry stone, but this corner held darker blocks, as if salvaged from ruins older than the priory itself. Ernild's voice echoed in his mind. "Look for stone that does not match stone." Renfis knelt again, and pressed his palm against the mismatched masonry. The surface felt colder than the earth itself. Cold in a way that bit. He drew back with a shudder. A faint vibration hummed beneath his feet. And then he heard it. A single, deliberate knock from somewhere behind the wall. Renfis froze. The sound came again. Knock. A pause. Knock. As though something was testing the stone from inside. Renfis' breath quickened. His heart thudded with deep, uneasy fear, yet he forced himself to remain still, to listen. Another knock. This time nearer the ground. He leaned toward the foundation, his lantern held low. A whisper of movement behind him made him turn so sharply the lantern nearly slipped from his grasp. A tall shape stood at the edge of the courtyard. The Watcher. It hovered above the ground exactly as before, cloak hanging motionless in the air despite the wind. Its faceless darkness faced him directly, and Renfis felt a pull, a strange sensation of being drawn toward the void beneath its hood. "Why do you come?" Renfis whispered, though he knew the Watcher would not answer. The figure shifted, not with human movement, but with a drifting glide that carried it a few paces closer. It lifted one long arm and pointed toward the dark stones of the foundation. Renfis swallowed hard. "You want me to open it," he murmured. The Watcher remained still. Renfis stood slowly, unsure of whether the Guardian intended to guide or judge him. He approached the dark stones once more. One of them bore a thin crack, barely visible in the lantern light. As he ran his fingers along the crack, he felt the stone shift. Only slightly, but enough. Renfis pressed both palms against it and pushed. The stone hesitated, resisting as though anchored by centuries of weight. He braced himself and pushed harder. The stones slid inward. Cold air rushed outward in a slow exhale that smelled of ancient earth, stagnant water, and something metallic. Behind the stone, A narrow void stretched downward like the mouth of a hidden stair. Renfis lifted his lantern and leaned forward. Old steps carved into deep rock spiraled into darkness. He felt the watcher behind him. Even without turning, he sensed its presence waiting, watching, silent and unyielding. Renfis inhaled unsteadily. "I cannot do this alone," he whispered, knowing full well the guardian offered no companionship. "But I must." With trembling resolve, he stepped into the hidden stairwell, leaving the cold courtyard above. As he descended, the narrow passage swallowed the lantern light. Shadows clung to the walls, and the air grew dense, laden with a presence that made his skin prickle. The relic lay somewhere below, and something else waited in the dark beside it. Renfis felt the truth of that before he even reached the final step. The air in the stairwell thickened as Brother Renfis descended, each step groaning under centuries of forgotten dust. The lantern flame struggled against the dampness, shrinking every few heartbeats as though the darkness itself pressed against it. You can imagine the steady rhythm of his boots on stone, a dull and muted sound swallowed by the weight of earth overhead. It had been only a short descent, perhaps no more than the height of a chapel wall, yet the narrow twisting passage made it feel as if he had been walking downward through the spine of the world. When he reached the final step, the stairwell widened into a chamber that seemed shaped by hands far older than the priory builders. The walls were carved from a kind of stone Renfis did not recognize. They shimmered faintly under the lantern glow, holding a sheen like river pebbles that had settled in deep water for countless seasons. The carvings upon them matched the strange symbols on Ernald's tablet, the circles and lines intersecting in patterns that tugged uneasily at the senses. Renfis whispered a soft prayer under his breath, less out of ritual and more from the instinctive desire to steady himself. There was something unsettling in the air here. It felt still in a way that denied the natural breath of the marsh above. No scent reached him, no hint of moving wind, only the cold pressed in slowly, like the closing of unseen hands. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal of dark stone. Upon it rested an object wrapped in linen, the fabric brittle with age. Renfis approached with measured steps, feeling the watcher lingering just behind him at the top of the stairwell. The guardian did not enter the chamber. It remained half-seen, its presence a boundary between the world of the living and the world of whatever lay beneath St. Havold. Renfis reached the pedestal. He extended his hand and touched the linen. It crumbled slightly, releasing a faint dust that drifted through the lantern light like ash. With gentle care, he peeled away the remnants of the cloth. Beneath it lay a smooth, rounded stone of pale grey, no larger than a clenched fist. It bore the same impossible markings as the walls, shallow grooves that glowed faintly as the lantern light touched them. The stone felt unnaturally cold. "This is the relic," Renfis murmured. "This small thing has kept the balance of the marsh for generations." He picked it up. The cold deepened instantly, shooting through his fingers and up his arm like icy water. His breath hitched. For a moment he felt as if the chamber shifted around him, though the walls did not move. It was a sensation rather than a sight, a swelling awareness of being observed not only by the watcher, but by something woven into the relic itself. Renfis closed his fingers around the stone, and forced himself to breathe steadily. At that moment, a faint tremor ran beneath his feet. Not an earthquake, nothing so large, more like the ground sighing with relief or anticipation. He stepped back from the pedestal. The tremor faded, but the cold in his hand deepened still. It felt as though the stone had been waiting for centuries to be moved, and now that he had lifted it, countless unseen stirrings began to shift in response. He turned toward the stairwell. The watcher had moved. It now hovered directly over the threshold, blocking the way out. Renfis tightened his grip on the lantern and relic. "You wanted me to find this," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But will you let me leave with it?" The watcher did not answer. It drifted backward a few inches, leaving room for him to pass. Renfis hesitated only briefly. Then he climbed the steps with slow caution, the ancient stone clutched firmly in his hand. As he reached the upper courtyard, he felt the air change around him. The wind stirred again. The mist shifted. The oppressive silence that had smothered everything earlier now lifted, allowing distant sounds of frogs and insects to return. The world seemed to exhale. Cillian still stood at the gatehouse, though now leaning his weight on the staff as if exhausted. "You were gone longer than I expected," Cillian said when Renfis approached. "The torches dimmed all at once a short while ago, though the oil was full." Renfis did not speak at first. He held out the relic, wrapped now in the linen he had gathered from below. This was hidden beneath the priory, he said. It is older than the marsh itself, and the Watcher guards it. Selian blinked in confusion. I do not understand. You do not need to, Renfis replied. But we must protect this, or the marsh will rise again. The land hungers for what it once held. Selian stared at him, then at the relic, then at the dark courtyard where the remaining torches wavered. He nodded in quiet acceptance, more out of trust than understanding. Renfis walked toward the chapel. The Watcher glided behind him, silent and patient. It kept its distance, but Renfis sensed that its presence remained tied to him now, perhaps to the relic as well. He entered the chapel and placed the stone at the foot of the altar. The faint markings glowed briefly under the candlelight, then settled into stillness. This time, the cold did not deepen. If anything, it softened, as if the relic recognized sanctuary. Renfis exhaled slowly. He had expected fear. Instead, he felt a gradual sense of calm washing over him. Not comfort, not safety, but balance. The marsh had been disturbed, yet the relic now rested in a place of quiet intention. Behind him, the Watcher drifted closer to the chapel doorway. It lingered in the threshold, as though the space itself held a boundary it would not cross. The faint lines of its form flickered like the edges of a candle flame. You can leave, Renfis said quietly, unsure why he spoke aloud. Your duty is fulfilled. But the Watcher did not leave. It remained exactly where it was, watching, waiting. The implication settled into Renfis with slow understanding. The danger was not yet gone. He looked down at the relic resting beneath the altar, then out toward the marsh beyond the priory walls. If the relic had been disturbed once, something might seek it again, something more tangible than the old legends. Men, perhaps, or forces that continued long after the tribes who once worshipped the Guardians had vanished. Renfis placed a hand on the altar. I will guard it, he whispered. As you have done. A faint stirring touched the air, almost like a sigh. The Watcher drifted backward a few paces, its form dimming slightly. It remained present, but no longer as a warning, more like an echo of the vow Renfis had just spoken. Outside, the returning wind brushed through the reeds and carried the first normal sounds of the night back to the priory. Somewhere in the fields, a sheep bleated uncertainly. The marsh was calming, settling, accepting. Renfis knew the brothers would never fully understand what had happened beneath their feet. He knew the villagers would whisper of strange nights for seasons to come. He knew Ernild's line of guardians would one day seek answers when the signs rose again. But for now, the relic rested in safety. And the Watcher remained at the boundary, its silent vow renewed. Yet Renfis could not shake one lingering thought. If the balance of the marsh required both relic and guardian, then what force had disturbed it in the first place? What unseen hand had pushed the land toward unrest, awakening the Watcher from long silence? And was that hand truly gone, or merely waiting for another moment to return? You are standing in the quiet foothills east of the old Imperial Road, a landscape shaped over countless seasons by slow rains, patient winds, and the steady movement of travelers who rarely linger long enough to remember the place. It is not a dramatic region, no jagged peaks, no roaring rivers, only rolling hills dotted with farmsteads, patches of woodland, and a centuries-old bridge of iron that most pass without a second thought. Yet, in the late medieval centuries, this bridge became the center of an odd legend, one that drifted through market squares and taverns like a rumor that refused to fade. The story spoke of a hermit who lived beside the iron bridge, a man who never aged, a wanderer who arrived from nowhere and refused all comfort, yet granted counsel to those who found him. Some claimed he spoke in riddles, others swore he possessed knowledge far beyond what any solitary holy man ought to know. And in a world where the line between superstition and truth remained thin, the tale of the hermit persisted for so many seasons that few remembered when it began. Yet what made this legend particularly strange was not the mysterious hermit himself, but the fact that he truly existed. This first section invites you into a slow and detailed look at the landscape, the history, and the arrival of the man who would become known simply as the Hermit of the Iron Bridge. As always, the calm pace and quiet descriptions guide your mind gently through history, offering the same steady rhythm you might feel while listening to soft rain against a window. The bridge itself had stood since the early days of the northern provinces, built under the rule of an empire that once stretched farther than any one traveler could reasonably cross in a single lifetime. Its iron frame was unusual in a region where most bridges relied on timber or fitted stone. No local smith could replicate it. The iron had been forged in distant workshops, shaped in molds that reached this quiet valley long before the smaller settlements grew around it. By the time the hermit arrived, the bridge was already ancient. Rust had crept across its surface in places where the original finish had flaked away. Weeds pushed between its stone supports. Carts rattled across it each morning, as farmers brought barley and flax to distant markets. Children sometimes played along the riverbank below, though they were warned never to linger after dusk, because the current could swell quickly when rains came down from the hills. In this calm setting, the hermit appeared as quietly as a shift in wind. The earliest accounts describe him as neither young nor old. His hair carried streaks of grey, yet his face seemed unlined, as though age had settled upon him unevenly. His clothing consisted of simple wool robes, rough in weave, but surprisingly clean for someone who slept outdoors. He wore no shoes, he spoke rarely, and when he did, his accent confused the villagers because it belonged to no region they recognized. His arrival went largely unnoticed at first. Many travelers passed through the valley on foot, some seeking work, others fleeing misfortune, and a few simply wandering with no destination. But unlike most travelers, the hermit stayed. During those early months, he made no attempt to build a shelter or carve out a living space. Instead, he settled near the foundation of the iron bridge, sitting for long stretches of the day with his back to the western support beam, while the river moved quietly beneath. When approached, he greeted people with a polite nod. When offered food, he accepted only the smallest portion. When asked questions, he answered softly, but directly, offering practical advice rather than lofty spiritual words. It was this practicality that set him apart. One villager once approached him with a sack of barley, complaining that pests had ruined nearly half his harvest. The hermit listened, then instructed him to dry crushed mint leaves on a flat stone, grind them into powder, and sprinkle them around the grain sacks. Though skeptical, the villager did as told. The pests vanished within days. Word spread quietly. Another villager had struggled with a stubborn cough through the winter. The hermit instructed her to boil honey with crushed pine resin. She drank the mixture over several evenings, and the cough eased despite the cold winds of early spring. These quiet acts of knowledge were the seeds of the legend. You may imagine the conversations that flowed through taverns along the old road. A farmer leaning over a wooden table, recounting the hermit's strange remedies. A young herdsman speaking of a man by the bridge, who appeared to know the shifting patterns of storms before they arrived. A passing merchant telling of a hermit who understood the nature of iron, as though he had studied in the distant workshops where the bridge had been forged. Slowly, people began to seek the hermit intentionally. They walked the dirt path that wound from the main village down to the river. Some carried offerings of bread or apples. Others brought questions both simple and wishful. A few arrived reluctantly, pushed by friends who believed the hermit possessed knowledge beyond their understanding. But the hermit remained consistent. He never claimed to foresee the future. He never asked for payment. He spoke only of the present, offering observations rooted in understanding rather than prophecy. One shepherd later wrote in his journal that the hermit did not seem wise in the way priests were wise. Instead, he seemed wise in the way old trees were wise. Silent, patient, and tethered to something deeper than the busyness of everyday life. Yet, despite the growing curiosity surrounding him, nearly nothing was known of the hermit's origins. When asked where he had come from, he offered gentle but evasive answers. From north of here, he once said, though his accent did not match the northern provinces. Another time he claimed, from a place that no longer stands. And once, when a traveling scribe pressed him for a more direct explanation, the hermit simply said, "I came from where the iron sleeps." It was this final phrase that began shaping the fresher rumors. People repeated it often, trying to interpret its meaning. Some believed he referred to an abandoned mine. Others thought he meant the ruins of a former smithing hall. A few guessed he used the phrase symbolically. The real truth would be uncovered only years later, but for now the phrase deepened his mystery. The iron bridge itself grew newly interesting in the minds of locals. They had long accepted it as an unavoidable feature of their landscape, but with the hermit living beside it, people began noticing its unusual construction. The bridge felt strangely cold to the touch, even on warm summer days. The supports rang with a deep metallic resonance when struck with the butt of a staff. Some swore that the sound echoed faintly longer than iron should. Was the hermit drawn to the bridge, or did he choose it for its solitude? No one could agree. What remained clear was that he rarely ventured far from it. In late summer of his first year, a group of children noticed he walked the length of the bridge twice daily at roughly the same hour, once at dawn, once at dusk. His steps were slow but measured, almost ritualistic. He paused at the midpoint each time, placing his hand on the railing before turning back toward the riverbank. When asked why, he simply said he listened to the river through the iron. There was nothing alarming in his behavior, nothing threatening or otherworldly, only a calm routine that seemed oddly comforting to those who observed it. Whatever feeling he carried with him spread quietly, encouraging peace rather than fear. Yet even the calmest routines can invite curiosity. A few villagers began to watch him more closely. They took note of the fact that despite living outdoors through autumn rains and winter frosts, the hermit never seemed weakened by the cold. His robes were thin, his feet bare, yet he moved with steady strength. This observation fed another round of legends. People said he had survived storms that toppled ash trees. Others whispered that wolves never approached the iron bridge when he slept beside it, and one woman claimed to have seen him standing on the riverbank during a violent winter flood, as still as a stone, with the rising water curling harmlessly around his ankles. Most of these stories were exaggerations, born from the natural way that people reshape their own memories. Yet, there was enough truth in the quiet durability of the hermit's presence that no one dismissed the tales entirely. The rumors began drifting east, reaching monasteries, villages, and remote hamlets. A handful of clerics traveled to the iron bridge to speak with the hermit. They approached him with doctrinal questions, hoping to uncover whether he belonged to a religious tradition they might recognize. But he responded with the same practical simplicity he gave to the farmers. He spoke of tending the earth, observing the seasons, and understanding the structure of metal and stone. His words did not contradict their teachings, but they did not echo them either. One cleric later wrote, "He lives as though knowledge itself is a form of prayer." Yet none of the visiting clerics could determine whether the hermit believed himself to be part of any faith at all. Over time, a small shelter took shape near the riverbank. It was not a hut in the familiar sense. Rather, it was a low lean-to made of woven branches pressed against a natural rise in the ground. The hermit built it not for comfort, but simply to keep his few tools dry through sudden rains. Inside the shelter he kept a wooden bowl, a narrow knife, a clay cup, and a smooth river stone that served as a grinding surface for herbs. He did not collect anything else. His belongings never increased. He lived with the barest essentials, yet he managed them with care and consistency. The simplicity of his existence became another part of his legend. People said he seemed content in a way that many envied but few understood. Years passed quietly. The hermit remained. The bridge stood. The river flowed. The valley continued its slow rhythm of planting and harvest. Nothing remarkable happened. That quietness might make you wonder why he became so memorable. But sometimes history remembers not because of dramatic events, but because an ordinary presence reveals something unusual beneath its calm surface. And that is where the truth behind the legend begins to deepen. Because in the hermit's fourth year beside the bridge, something happened that shifted the valley out of its peaceful routine. Something that forced the villagers to look beyond the simple explanations they had been telling themselves. It began with a single morning when the hermit did not take his dawn walk across the iron bridge. A small detail, a simple break in habit. But for a man whose patterns had remained unbroken for so long, it was enough to signal that something in the valley had changed. And as the villagers soon learned, the hermit had not missed his walk by accident. The river had shown him something during the night. Something hidden beneath the iron. Something that would draw him into the center of a forgotten truth. What had the hermit seen in the darkness before dawn? You continue your quiet journey into the strange story of a medieval object that should not have survived as long as it did. The manuscript that scholars whispered about behind closed doors has now crossed half a continent by the time this part of the tale begins. What follows is the slow unraveling of the belief that it carried a dangerous charm, a belief that seemed to cling to every person who touched it. You will find that in the late medieval centuries, fear and documentation often walked together, creating a peculiar record of human anxiety that feels both distant and familiar. When the manuscript left the priory in the northern mountains, it was carried by a cleric named Brother Aldrich. He was chosen not for bravery but for the simple reason that he could read well and had steady hands. In the world of parchment and ink, steady hands were valued more than courage. Aldrich was quiet and methodical, a man who preferred copying small theological notes to dealing with merchants or travelers. Yet he accepted the task because obedience was a way of life. You can imagine him stepping through the wooden gate of his home, the cool air of early morning brushing his face, the manuscript wrapped in wool within his satchel. The brothers did not speak the word cursed aloud. They simply told him that the volume needed to reach a regional ecclesiastical council where learned men would examine its unusual features. Aldrich travelled by foot first, following the long paths carved by shepherds and monks over generations. These routes were not roads, as you picture them today. They were narrow passages where the earth was packed by the weight of sandals and hooves, bordered by shrubs that clung to the rocky soil. Along the way, Aldrich recorded small details in his travel notes. These notes still survive, partially preserved in an archive, though the edges are worn. He wrote about the texture of the earth beneath his shoes, the way the sky seemed unusually clear, and the quietness of the surrounding valleys. His observations were mundane, yet they reveal a mind seeking comfort in routine, as he carried something he did not fully understand. By the third day, Aldrich reached a small village known for its wooden mills. When he asked for lodging, a miller agreed to offer him a bed for the night. As the mill wheel turned with a gentle groan beside the house, Aldrich sat at the table and removed the manuscript from his satchel to check that it was still dry. The miller saw the vellum, and asked the question that many people asked in those years. He wanted to know whether the book was expensive. Books were rare objects, and even the simplest one represented labor that could span months. Aldrich answered truthfully that he did not know its value but that it contained unusual drawings that confused scholars. The miller, perhaps out of curiosity, leaned closer. Aldrich instinctively closed the cover. Later that night, a storm struck the village. Wind shook the wooden walls, and rain hammered the roof. In the morning, the miller said that storms often visited the valley without warning. Still, he noted that the winds felt strangely fierce for that season. When Aldrich prepared to leave, the miller pressed a wooden charm into his hand, insisting that it offered protection on long journeys. Aldrich did not believe in charms, but he thanked him out of courtesy. The matter would have ended there, an ordinary interaction in an ordinary village, if not for what happened later in the day. Aldrich followed a forest path that led him toward a river ferry. About halfway through the woodland, a tree branch fell near his feet. It was large enough that it could have injured him. He wrote later that he heard no wind during that moment. The forest was still, yet the branch fell. When he reached the riverside ferry station, the ferryman refused to cross, not because of the weather, but because he had seen Aldrich earlier through the trees and noticed a faint glow reflecting from the satchel. Aldrich could not explain this. Perhaps it was sunlight catching on a metal clasp, or perhaps the ferryman simply imagined a glimmer. Yet the ferryman insisted that he would not take him across until the following morning. At this point in the tale, you begin to see how legends form. A simple coincidence, a single misunderstanding, or a moment of superstition could begin to shape a story that grows larger with every retelling. Aldrich spent the night in the ferryman's hut. As he slept, he dreamed of swirling shapes like the ones drawn in the manuscript. When he woke, he felt unsettled. His travel notes reveal that he avoided opening the book that morning. Instead, he wrapped it more tightly in wool and placed it deeper in his satchel. This detail is important, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it shows how belief can influence behavior even in people who consider themselves rational. When he finally reached the ecclesiastical council, Aldrich surrendered the manuscript to a group of scholars. These men represented different regions, and each had traveled far to attend the gathering. The manuscript was placed on a wooden table, surrounded by wax candles whose flames flickered gently. You might imagine that the scholars opened the book immediately and began debating its origin. Yet records show that they first examined the materials. They tested the vellum to see whether it came from sheep, goat, or calf. They studied the ink composition, comparing it to known formulas used by scribes in monasteries across the continent. They even measured the margins and cross-referenced them with codices from certain scriptoria. This part of medieval scholarship was slow, patient, and somewhat tedious, yet it was the foundation of how knowledge moved from one generation to another. Once they moved on to the illustrations inside, the council became divided. Some scholars argued that the swirling shapes resembled astronomical diagrams. Others believed that the symbols represented herbal remedies. A third group insisted that the designs were purely decorative. What all of them agreed upon, however, was that the structure of the writing did not match any known language. This was not unusual by itself. Scholars in that period frequently misinterpreted unfamiliar scripts, but here the writing seemed to follow consistent patterns without aligning to any alphabet. This gave rise to the belief that the text might be a cipher, one that required a key which had long been lost. Ciphers in the medieval world were not common, yet they did exist in political communication and private correspondence among nobles. Despite the scholarly debate, a whisper began among attendants that the manuscript caused misfortune. One scholar burned his hand on a candle, which would have been dismissed easily if not for other small events. A scribe dropped his inkhorn, spilling everything onto the floor. Another attendant fainted during a particularly warm afternoon, though he later admitted he had eaten very little that day. Each incident was minor on its own, yet when grouped together, they created an atmosphere of unease. People began avoiding touching the manuscript directly and used cloths instead. Some even claimed that the drawings seemed to shift in color under certain light, though this was likely due to the varying composition of pigments. The council ended without a firm conclusion about the manuscript. Aldrich had hoped that handing it over would free him from responsibility, yet within a few days the scholars decided it should be sent to another center of learning. They requested that Aldrich transport it again, as he had already proven reliable. He did not protest, but his notes show a long pause on the page before he resumed writing. This suggests he felt a growing discomfort, though he remained committed to his duty. As Aldrich left the council, he carried the manuscript through a region known for its river plains. These plains flooded often, creating fertile soil but also making travel unpredictable. Merchants, peasants, and pilgrims frequently became stranded when rain arrived suddenly. Aldrich found lodging in a roadside shelter maintained by a small community of laborers who tended nearby fields. That night, heavy rainfall soaked the area. Aldrich stayed awake, listening to the steady rhythm of drops hitting the wooden roof. In the morning, he discovered that the road ahead had turned into slippery mud. What happened next became one of the most repeated anecdotes in later retellings of the legend. As Aldrich walked through the muddy path, he slipped and fell backward. His satchel struck the ground, sinking partially into the wet soil. When he opened it to check the manuscript, he found that the wool wrapping was perfectly dry. Nothing inside was damaged. The workers nearby said this was a sign that the book protected itself. Aldrich insisted that the wool had been wrapped tightly enough to withstand the fall and moisture. Still, the story spread quickly across the region, and by the time he reached the next town, people believed that he carried an object with strange resilience. In the town, a local official requested to examine the manuscript. Aldrich agreed. Following the proper customs of hospitality and authority, the official turned the pages with interest, and then asked how old the manuscript was. Aldrich repeated what he had been told, that its age was uncertain, but likely older than most codices in local archives. The official remarked that it smelled faintly of lavender. Aldrich was surprised. He had never noticed such a scent. It is possible that the official imagined the smell, or perhaps it came from the wool cloth used for storage. Lavender was commonly used to keep insects away from stored garments. Regardless, the comment added to the growing set of odd observations that travelled with the manuscript. By the time Aldrich prepared to leave that town, he felt as if the manuscript had become heavier, though it weighed the same. The heaviness came from the collective burden of rumors, expectations, and anxious comments offered by strangers. Stories often acquire weight in this way. They gather ideas, fears, and interpretations until the object at the center becomes something more symbolic than physical. Aldrich continued westward, moving toward a coastal region, where the next center of learning was located. He stayed in monasteries when he could, in barns when he had no other option, and occasionally with families who welcomed travelers. Everywhere he went, people wanted to know what he carried. Even when he tried to keep the manuscript hidden, someone inevitably noticed the careful way he handled his satchel. By the time he reached the coast, Aldrich had begun to question why the manuscript existed at all, who had created it, and for what purpose. Why had its creator chosen a script that no one could read? Why had they filled its pages with drawings that resembled nothing familiar, yet appeared intentional? These questions were as old as the manuscript itself, and Aldrich was only one in a long line of curious minds wrestling with them. As he stood on the shoreline watching waves roll gently toward the stones, he wondered whether delivering the manuscript to yet another set of scholars would finally reveal its origin, or whether it would continue slipping into new hands, creating new rumors and fears. You return once more to the quiet path where Brother Aldrich walks, the manuscript held close beneath layers of wool and care. By this time in the late medieval years, the manuscript has gathered an invisible trail of rumors behind it, stretching across valleys, rivers, towns, and monasteries. The odd coincidences that surrounded Aldrich's travels have become small stories repeated in markets and on pilgrim roads, each one gaining new detail with every retelling. As you step into the final part of this account, you follow the manuscript as it reaches the largest scholarly community it would ever encounter, and you watch how a quiet object can influence an entire generation of anxious minds. Aldrich made his way toward the Coastal Learning Center, which was not a university in the way you think of the term today. Instead, it was a cluster of buildings maintained by clerics, scholars, and a small number of wealthy patrons. It held a library known for collecting unusual texts. Some of these books were written in languages no longer spoken. Others contained scientific diagrams or theological debates that challenged the understanding of earlier centuries. A place like this attracted minds that valued curiosity. Yet, even here rumor traveled faster than evidence. Word reached the center before Aldrich did. People had already begun whispering that a strange manuscript was on its way. When Aldrich arrived, he felt a sense of relief. The heavy coastal air carried the scent of salt, and the sound of gulls called above the rooftops. The familiar rhythm of waves offered a grounding sensation after weeks of rain, wind, and mud. The scholars greeted him politely and offered him a small cell in the guest quarters. They promised that the manuscript would be examined carefully and without superstition. Aldrich allowed himself to hope that his task was finally nearing its end. The next morning, the scholars gathered in a stone hall lit by narrow windows that allowed the soft coastal light to spill across the table. The manuscript was placed at the center. Candles were added for additional clarity. You can imagine Aldrich standing behind the table, watching anxiously as the scholars opened the volume. They turned the pages slowly, noting the smoothness of the vellum, the consistency of the strokes, and the strange symbols that still defied interpretation. The tone in the room was professional, calm, and even hopeful at first. One of the senior scholars, a thoughtful man named Master Roland, examined the first few illustrations. He noted that the swirling patterns might reflect astronomical attempts common among certain monastic groups in earlier centuries. Another scholar disagreed immediately, arguing that the shapes seemed closer to herbal diagrams. The debate was mild at first, but grew stronger as they progressed through the pages. What had been mere curiosity soon shifted into something more intense. The manuscript did not reveal its secrets. Each page only deepened the sense of uncertainty. As the hours passed, Aldrich observed something he had not expected. The scholars, usually patient and orderly, began showing signs of agitation. They accused one another of misinterpretation. They insisted that the others were overlooking clues. Even minor disagreements grew sharper. One scholar knocked over a candle while reaching for a quill. Another spilled ink across his notes. Aldrich could not help but remember the earlier small accidents that had surrounded the manuscript during his journey. By midday, the scholars took a break. They left the hall to clear their thoughts and enjoy a simple meal. Aldrich remained behind, staring at the manuscript on the table. He felt a strange quietness settle around him. He knew that the logical explanation for the tension among the scholars was the pressure of the task. Yet he could not shake the feeling that every group that touched the book seemed to experience the same gradual rise in unease. Over the next several days, the scholars worked tirelessly, trying to decipher the text. They created charts comparing repeated symbols. They noted patterns that looked grammatical but did not match any known language. They attempted to identify the pigments used in the illustrations. They even compared the manuscript to old codices brought from distant monasteries. Yet they found nothing that provided a clear origin or meaning. Their frustration grew, and around them, the legend grew with it. A novice in the library claimed he heard the pages rustle on their own. A servant believed the manuscript felt warm to the touch. A scholar insisted that one drawing appeared to glow faintly during the early evening light. None of these claims were recorded formally, but they circulated through the community, adding new layers to the growing myth. Meanwhile, Aldrich watched quietly from the edges, no longer entirely confident in his earlier rational explanations. Eventually, Master Roland made a decision. He believed that the manuscript might be older than originally thought. He suggested that it should be compared with material from a distant archive located across the sea. This archive was known for preserving rare texts collected by travelers who had journeyed through southern regions. Aldrich felt his stomach tighten when the scholars proposed that he should carry the manuscript once again. He had hoped that his responsibility was finished. Yet he agreed to the task. His loyalty to duty had guided him from the beginning, and he was not ready to refuse now. The sea crossing was difficult. The The vessel that carried Aldrich and the manuscript was a modest coastal ship with one mast and a crew of fishermen who occasionally transported travelers. The winds were steady at first, but midway through the journey clouds formed and the waves grew restless. The crew worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting the sails and ropes. Aldrich stayed below deck, holding the satchel tightly as water splashed against the hull. The sailors told him the storm was typical for the season, but Aldrich could not help recalling all the minor misfortunes that had followed him for weeks. When the ship finally reached the distant port, Aldrich thanked the crew and stepped onto land with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The archive he sought was located several miles inland. He followed a dusty road lined with olive trees, their branches swaying gently. The calmness of the landscape helped settle his mind. For a moment he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the manuscript would finally find an explanation here. The archive was housed in a stone building surrounded by a modest garden. It was maintained by scholars who specialized in ancient texts. They welcomed Aldrich and listened carefully as he described the manuscript's journey. Unlike earlier groups, these scholars approached the volume with a methodical calmness that came from long practice. They examined the writing, the illustrations, and the vellum with slow care. Their reactions were measured. Their voices remained steady. Yet even here, something happened that would be remembered for years. One night, while Aldrich slept in a small guest room, a tremor shook the building. It was mild, lasting only a few moments, but enough to cause a few scrolls to fall from their shelves. The scholars later recorded this as a small regional tremor, not uncommon in that area. Still, some claimed afterward that it had occurred at the exact moment the manuscript was left open on a central table. Over the following week, the scholars studied the manuscript more deeply than any group before them. They identified several pigments that likely originated from multiple distant regions, suggesting that the creator had access to materials uncommon in the northern lands. They noted that the pattern of symbols was too consistent to be random and too complex to be decorative. They did not believe it was a cipher meant for political purposes. Instead, they speculated that it might represent a language from a cultural group whose written traditions had not survived elsewhere. Ultimately, the scholars concluded that the manuscript was not cursed, not supernatural, and not intentionally mysterious. Instead, it was simply a product of a world that had lost many of its written traditions. It represented a fragment of human knowledge from an unknown community, preserved against all odds. They believed that the unease surrounding it arose from the tension between its complexity and their inability to understand it. Aldrich listened to their conclusions with mixed emotions. He felt relief that the scholars regarded the manuscript with calm logic, yet he also felt something else. A quiet awareness that he had become part of a long chain of people shaped by the manuscript. He was not the first to carry it, and he would not be the last. Through time, every attempt to interpret it only deepened its place in history. It was not dangerous. It was simply unknown, and this uncertainty was enough to create legends. Before Aldrich left the archive, he was allowed to walk through the garden. There, he reflected on everything he had witnessed. He realized that the manuscript's influence did not come from any supernatural force. Instead, it came from the human tendency to fill gaps in understanding with imagination. The manuscript was a mirror for the fears, hopes, and curiosities of everyone who encountered it. When the time came for Aldrich to return home, he traveled lighter, carrying no manuscript with him. The archive would keep it for preservation and study. Aldrich walked through quiet fields, recalling the many moments along his journey when the manuscript had seemed to shape events around him. Now, with distance, he could see those moments more clearly. None of them required a supernatural cause, yet he understood how easily ordinary incidents could gather into something resembling a legend. By the time Aldrich reached his home priory, he was changed. He had witnessed not a curse, but the way stories evolve when knowledge is incomplete. The brothers listened quietly as he described what had happened. They were relieved that the manuscript was in safe hands. And yet, even then, they whispered about the minor accidents, the strange dreams, and the quiet tension that had accompanied its travel. The legend remained alive. In the later centuries, the manuscript continued to puzzle scholars. Wars came and went. Libraries burned and were rebuilt. Languages shifted. Yet the manuscript remained intact, moving slowly across generations. Each group that examined it added another layer to its story. And even in your time, you can find people who still claim that the manuscript carries a subtle presence, something that resists complete understanding. This raises one last thought, something that lingers as you step away from this tale. If an object remains unreadable long enough, Does it truly hold a secret, or do people create one around it, shaping meaning from silence? You are now entering a story that drifts quietly through centuries of time, a story less of kings and battles and more of sound, or rather the absence of it. In the late medieval period, abbeys were centers of ritual, labor and observation. They were places where hours were measured by bells, where monks moved with exact precision, and where silence itself was a form of devotion. Among these many abbeys, Blackwood Abbey earned a peculiar reputation. Travelers spoke not of its architecture or its library, but of a single bell that refused to ring. The tale begins in the year 1412, a year notable for the slow unfolding of ordinary events that, over decades, coalesced into legend. The abbey had been established in the forested hills along a river, whose course was gentle, yet unpredictable during heavy rainfall. The monks of Blackwood Abbey followed a strict daily routine: prayers at sunrise and sunset, labor in the scriptorium copying texts, tending to gardens, and overseeing small-scale craftwork for sustenance. Among them was a bell ringer, Brother Eisenwald, responsible for sounding the abbey's largest bell, which measured nearly 5 feet across and weighed more than a ton. It was said that the bell, forged in the early 13th century by a smith from the neighboring province, possessed a tone unlike any other. Its resonance could carry for miles through the dense forest, warning villagers of time, signaling meals or calling the faithful to prayer. For generations the bell functioned reliably, its voice embedded in the rhythm of everyday life. But sometime in the early months of 1412, it fell silent. No one could determine why. The rope hung motionless, the metal clapper remained suspended, and even the most forceful strikes failed to produce sound. Brother Eisenwald first noticed the anomaly during the pre-dawn bell tolling. He had pulled the rope as usual, a practiced motion repeated hundreds of times since his arrival at the abbey. The bell should have sung, but instead, there was only a hollow vibration, faint and quickly absorbed by the surrounding air. The monks assumed it was a minor issue, a simple adjustment of the clapper or a loose fitting. Yet, when the smith from the neighboring town arrived and examined the bell, he found nothing wrong. The metal was intact. The clapper was properly aligned. Even the supporting beams, aged but well maintained, showed no fault. The monks began recording each attempt to ring the bell, a meticulous practice in keeping with their devotion to observation. They noted the times of day, the weather, the position of the rope, and even the emotional state of the bell ringer, believing that diligence could yield understanding. Despite these records, the bell remained silent. This inexplicable quiet grew into a matter of concern, not only for the abbey's monks, but also for nearby villagers, who had long relied on the sound to mark time for communal labor, market activities, and religious gatherings. Interestingly, the silence of the bell did not immediately disrupt life in a practical sense. The monks continued their prayers, relying on the natural rising and setting of the sun to mark their canonical hours. The villagers adjusted their routines by estimating time from sunlight or by using smaller bells scattered through the community. Yet the silence carried a psychological weight. People began attributing extraordinary significance to it. Some whispered that it was a sign of divine displeasure. Others feared it might foreshadow a calamity, though no specific disaster had yet presented itself. Historical records reveal that even noble visitors were drawn to Blackwood Abbey to witness the silent bell. One particularly detailed account comes from a traveling scribe who noted the strangeness of standing near a massive bell that could not sound. He described the effect as a heaviness upon the chest, as if the air itself had grown thick with expectation. The scribe spent several nights at the abbey, observing the monks' careful rituals around the bell. He recorded that some monks spoke in hushed tones of previous centuries, of bells that had silenced for days after violent storms or after important abbots passed away. Yet in those cases, the bells eventually resumed their calls. Here at Blackwood Abbey, the silence stretched beyond normal patterns. The legend of the silent bell spread slowly at first, carried by travelers, scribes, and merchants. Unlike the sensational tales of kings, sieges, or miraculous healings, this story was subtle. Its intrigue came from what it lacked: a sound that had been expected, a function that should have been ordinary, and the quiet persistence of anomaly. People began to record their experiences, some in letters, some in marginal notes of other chronicles, until the tale formed a continuous, though understated, historical record. Some attempts to understand the silence involved experimentation with the bell itself. One monk attached small weights to the clapper, hypothesizing that mass could influence vibration. Another tested the rope's angle and tension to see if the swing was insufficient. A third examined the interior of the bell for the smallest cracks or dents invisible to the naked eye. None of these interventions restored the sound. What is most remarkable about this story is how ordinary human persistence intersected with a simple, unexplained anomaly. The monks did not abandon their duties. They did not allow superstition to overwhelm routine, and yet, the psychological impact remained. The abbey became a place where silence itself was observed with the same rigor as spoken prayer, where a lack of sound became a subject of meditation and reflection. And now you may wonder, if the bell remained silent despite all practical efforts to restore it, what underlying factor could have caused such a phenomenon? Was it a quirk of metallurgy, an environmental influence, or something that escapes even careful historical scrutiny? And most importantly, what might the monks have learned about the nature of routine, patience, and observation from living beside a bell that refused to speak? The silence of the bell persisted through the months that followed its first mysterious failure, becoming a fixture in the rhythm of Blackwood Abbey's life. Brother Isenwald, once confident in his understanding of routine and mechanics, now approached each day with a quiet tension, as if the bell's muteness had become an unspoken measure of his own vigilance. He rose with the sun, walked the stone corridors of the abbey, and carried out his duties with the same diligence as before, but always with one eye on the massive bell. He adjusted the rope, tapped the clapper lightly, and listened. Nothing, not even the faintest hum. The surrounding forest seemed to take notice of the change. Though you might think this is fanciful, birds that once nested in the trees near the abbey remained unusually quiet. The river below the stone bridge that spanned the forested stream carried its usual current, yet the wind that usually rustled the reeds seemed to pause as if in anticipation of sound that would never come. Whether this was real, or simply the heightened perception of monks and travellers attuned to anomaly, no one could say for certain. Yet by the late spring of 1413, the silent bell had become a symbol of patient endurance for those who observed it closely. Monks from nearby priories began visiting to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Some arrived out of curiosity, others out of concern that divine wrath might be signalled by the mute bell. Brother Isenwald welcomed them politely, but without ceremony. He allowed them to inspect the bell, observe its clapper, and even attempt to swing the rope themselves. Each visitor produced the same result, a deep hollowing vibration, a small echo swallowed immediately by the forest and abbey walls, and nothing more. One visiting monk, a scholar named Father Wolfstan, suggested a practical experiment. He proposed covering the bell with cloth to dampen its resonance, theorizing that over centuries, iron can accumulate microfractures that alter its tonal properties. The experiment was undertaken carefully, with each step recorded in meticulous detail. The bell was wrapped in wool, struck gently with the wooden mallet, and even rotated slightly on its axis where it hung. Still, no meaningful sound emerged. It was during one of these experimental sessions that a subtle discovery occurred, one that would feed the legend for generations to come. Father Wolfstan noticed that on the rare occasions when a candle's flame flickered, just so, light reflecting off the bell's surface revealed tiny hairline fissures previously unseen. They were not enough to fracture the metal entirely, nor enough to explain a total absence of resonance. Yet they hinted at a delicate imbalance in the bell's internal structure. Could this be the reason, or was it merely coincidence, a physical imperfection magnified in the eyes of those who watched too closely? Meanwhile, the abbey's daily life continued largely undisturbed. Meals were taken on schedule, prayers recited on time, and gardens tended with routine care. Yet the absence of the bell's voice had an almost imperceptible effect on perception. Time itself seemed to stretch differently in Blackwood Abbey. Without the auditory cue to mark hours, monks relied more heavily on natural light, the position of the sun across the sky, the sound of water in the river, or the distant calls of birds and beasts. Their awareness of rhythm became intimate, subtle, and almost meditative. Visitors noted this shift. One scribe, who stayed several nights, recorded in his journal, "The absence of sound sharpens the senses. I hear the beating of my own pulse more clearly than I have in years." Another wrote, "Time moves differently here. Without the bell, one becomes aware of the small stirrings of life that ordinarily go unnoticed." These reflections transformed what might have been considered an inconvenience into a profound, if understated, historical observation. By the winter of 1414, a curious pattern had emerged. Travellers reported dreams influenced by the abbey's silence, dreams of quiet corridors, of massive stones waiting to speak, and of unbroken time, measured not by bells but by the slow drift of light and shadow. Local villagers began describing subtle effects too. Their own clocks and small bells seemed slightly off when compared to the abbey, and some claimed that wandering near the monastery during the evening brought an unusual calm, almost as if the silence itself radiated outward. Yet despite all observations, no definitive cause for the bell's muteness could be found. Even the master bellmakers from distant towns, summoned after weeks of correspondence, could offer no conclusive explanation. They measured, struck, and inspected every aspect of the bell's form. They tested its clapper, the supporting beams, the angle of suspension, and the density of the iron. Every measurement fell within acceptable ranges. Still, no sound came. This lack of resolution began to influence the way the monks understood the abbey. The silent bell was no longer merely an object of concern. It had become an instrument of reflection. It reminded those who lived and worked there that not all questions have immediate answers, and that patience, observation, and endurance often hold their own significance. Some monks began writing contemplative texts inspired by the bell's muteness, exploring themes of silence, perception, and the human relationship with time. These texts were circulated quietly among neighboring abbeys, contributing to the slow spread of the Blackwood legend. The bell itself remained unchanged, silent, heavy, and waiting, but its impact on human thought had grown quietly yet profoundly. And as you imagine the abbey under a pale winter moon, with the massive bell unmoving, and the surrounding forest wrapped in frost, you may begin to see why this story persisted. Not because of danger or spectacle, but because a simple, silent object forced humans to observe life differently, to notice rhythms and patterns that often go unrecorded, and to consider the subtle ways in which time and attention shape perception. Yet the ultimate question lingers. If a bell designed to produce sound remains silent for years, is its purpose failed, or has it achieved a new function entirely, one that cannot be measured by noise, but by the quiet awareness it instills? The silence of Blackwood Abbey's bell had become a defining feature of its landscape and life. By the time the third year of muteness arrived, the abbey itself had adjusted to this anomaly, and the monks' routines had adapted in ways both practical and subtle. Brother Asenwald no longer approached the bell with hope or dread, but with quiet acceptance. Each dawn he walked through the stone corridors, preparing for the canonical hours, while the massive bell loomed above the cloisters like a patient observer. Its mute presence had become a companion of sorts, an unspoken participant in daily devotion. The surrounding communities, who had initially worried over the lack of the bell's familiar toll, gradually adapted as well. Farmers began timing their work by the sun, relying on natural markers rather than the distant echo of iron. Travelers, once disoriented by the absence of sound, learned to notice subtle cues in the forest. The call of birds, the creak of timber underfoot, the whisper of wind across fields. In a curious way, the silence encouraged attentiveness to the ordinary, teaching people to measure time not with instruments, but with careful observation of the world around them. Yet the abbey's silent bell did not go unnoticed entirely. Scholars and pilgrims continued to visit. Drawn by the tale that had spread through whispers and letters, they came to see an anomaly, but many left with something more profound, a reflection on patience, routine, and the unexpected lessons of unremarkable events. One traveler recorded that standing beneath the massive bell, feeling the weight of metal suspended in air, he understood that silence itself could carry meaning, shaping thought as much as any audible signal. Over the decades, the abbey undertook meticulous efforts to maintain the bell. Each year, monks inspected its frame, the rope, and clapper. Every crack, every blemish, was documented, and yet no adjustment restored the sound. Iron, after all, is resilient, and though the bell remained intact, it had entered a quiet dialogue with human perception. It would not respond in the way people expected, but it demanded awareness of its stillness. Interestingly, historical records suggest that the bell's silence indirectly fostered innovation within the abbey. Lacking a reliable auditory marker for time, the monks developed more precise sundials, carefully noting the sun's arc across the cloisters. They also kept detailed written schedules, and began experimenting with smaller handbells to supplement daily routine. These adaptations, mundane in isolation, collectively transformed the abbey into a place of heightened discipline and observation, a transformation rooted entirely in an ordinary object that failed to perform its intended function. Some attempts to reinterpret the bell's silence took on a symbolic dimension. Poetic entries in the abbey's records framed it as a meditation on human patience. Others suggested that the bell had achieved a new purpose, not to mark hours or summon worshippers, but to remind those nearby of the limits of expectation and the value of attentive observation. Monks reflected that life itself often produces outcomes unaligned with intent. Yet these deviations can teach lessons deeper than any deliberate design. There are accounts of curious interactions as well. A visiting noblewoman, staying at the abbey for several days, wrote of experiencing dreams filled with the resonance she expected but never heard. The dreams were vivid, encompassing the sound of the bell she longed for, echoing across imaginary forests and cloistered halls. She awoke to silence, yet she described a sense of fulfillment, as if the bell's absence had forced her mind to create its own meaning. By the late 15th century, Blackwood Abbey had long embraced the bell's silence as a permanent feature. Its story had spread across provinces, and eventually found its way into chronicles, describing unusual phenomena in religious institutions. Historians, centuries later, would note that the silent bell represented more than mechanical failure. It illustrated the slow, patient evolution of human adaptation, the way communities respond to anomalies, and the subtle power of observation when sound, or action, is absent. And here lies the final reflection. The bell, though incapable of producing the sound it was built for, achieved a form of resonance beyond metal and rope. Its silence shaped lives, instilled reflection, and quietly connected individuals to the rhythms of nature and thought. Perhaps in some ways it fulfilled its purpose more fully than a bell that rang predictably. So you are left with a quiet but persistent thought. Can an object's value be measured not by what it does, but by the awareness it inspires when it does nothing at all? You now step into a story that unfolds not through battles of swords or walls crumbling under cannon fire, but through a slow and largely unnoticed siege that challenged both patience and perception. Dunholm Keep, a small fortress perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking a twisting river, had long been a minor stronghold in a contested region of medieval Europe. It was not famed for grand architecture or sweeping victories, yet in the early 15th century, it became the center of a curious military episode, a siege that existed almost entirely in the minds of its participants, and yet had real consequences. The year was 1415, a time when political tension between neighboring duchies simmered like a cauldron left over a low flame. Dunholm Keep's lord, Sir Alaric von Wren, was a minor noble whose influence extended no further than his immediate lands. Yet his location was strategically significant. It commanded a river crossing that connected fertile farmlands to trade routes leading to the coast. Control of this pass had the potential to shift local economics, yet it was small enough that chroniclers later overlooked it. The first signs of the siege were subtle. Scouts reported that small bands of enemy soldiers had been observed across the river, lingering at the edges of the forest rather than directly assaulting the keep. These troops made no attempt at a traditional siege with ladders, battering rams, or formal encirclement. Instead, they performed slow, deliberate movements along the riverbank and in the foothills, appearing and disappearing with the patterns of daily life. Sir Alaric found this behavior perplexing. Was it reconnaissance, intimidation, or merely coincidence? Inside Dunholm, life initially proceeded as normal. The garrison consisted of about 40 men-at-arms, supplemented by a handful of local farmers and labourers pressed into temporary service. The castle's food stores were modest but sufficient for several months. Daily routines, guard shifts, meal preparation, and training exercises continued largely uninterrupted. Yet the psychological effect of knowing that enemy troops could be watching at any moment began to seep into behavior. Guards became hyper-vigilant, often peering through arrow slits for hours without relief. Labourers moved with unusual care, aware that any misstep could be observed and reported. What makes this siege unusual and almost invisible is that there was rarely direct confrontation. No arrows flew across the river, no walls were battered by siege engines, and no tents were pitched in immediate proximity. Instead, the threat existed in anticipation, in the expectation of conflict, in the small miscalculations prompted by anxiety. The enemy forces, aware that Dunholm Keep had limited supplies, relied on the principle of psychological attrition. By remaining nearby and maintaining constant, if indirect, pressure, they hoped to weaken the defenders' resolve over time. Sir Alaric, a man accustomed to conventional warfare, initially underestimated the strategy. He attempted minor sorties to scout the enemy's position, sending small groups along the river and into the forests. Each time they returned with reports of empty glades, disturbed foliage, or footprints that appeared inconsistent with the number of men he expected to find. Nothing conclusive could be determined, yet every attempt reinforced a sense of unease. The defenders began to feel the presence of a siege without a visible opponent, as though the enemy's intent was to be everywhere at once, without ever committing to action. Food and water became central concerns despite the lack of physical assault. Sir Alaric inspected the granaries daily, rationing carefully, and implemented strict schedules for consumption. Water from the cistern was monitored to avoid waste. The garrison's morale fluctuated with minor events. A sudden storm that washed away the river's shallow ford could be interpreted as divine intervention, or an ominous sign that the enemy might exploit. The uncertainty itself became a weapon, invisible yet powerful, shaping every decision. Chroniclers later noted that some of the defenders began to record their own observations in journals, though they were not yet intended for historical preservation. One guard wrote of the strangeness of hearing movement in the forest yet never seeing anyone. Another described the sensation of being watched during meals, despite the empty battlements. Even Sir Alaric himself, a practical and disciplined man, admitted in a private letter that the siege seemed more in the mind than on the earth. Yet its effects were unmistakable. Outside Dunholm, the opposing commander, whose name is lost to time, emphasized caution and patience. He understood that direct engagement with a well-defended position, even a small keep, risked unnecessary casualties. Instead, his strategy relied on observation, subtle interference with supply routes, and psychological pressure. Scouts spread rumors in nearby villages about the supposed strength and cruelty of Dunholm's defenders. These rumors, in turn, reached the keep and heightened the defenders' anxiety, creating a feedback loop of perception and expectation. Over weeks, minor incidents intensified the sense of siege. A single cow strayed and fell into the river, forcing guards to divert attention to rescue it. A miscommunication during rationing led to a temporary shortage of bread at the Western Tower. Each small, mundane event was magnified in importance, as the defenders linked them, consciously or unconsciously, to the presence of the unseen enemy. The siege became a battle not of swords or walls, but of nerves, perception, and discipline. And here, as the first section draws to a close, you are left with a curious thought: a siege without visible conflict, fought entirely through anticipation and observation. Can it truly be called a siege, or is it something more subtle, a reflection of human psychology under stress? The siege of Dunholm Keep continued, and with each passing week the psychological strain on the defenders became increasingly apparent. The invisible nature of the threat forced Sir Alaric and his men to develop a new type of vigilance, one that tested endurance more than martial skill. Guards rotated tirelessly, keeping eyes on the forests, the riverbanks, and the distant hills. Even the smallest movement, an animal stirring among reeds, a shadow across the walls, was treated with caution, catalogued and scrutinized. Ordinary actions became imbued with weight. A dropped tool or a misstep in the courtyard could seem catastrophic. Food stores, carefully measured from the start, now required extraordinary attention. Sir Alaric instituted strict rationing, dividing daily bread and water with military precision. Livestock was rotated among pens, each animal watched to prevent loss. Meals were quiet and deliberate, not out of tradition, but because the defenders felt that any carelessness might be observed and exploited. The psychological warfare waged by the unseen enemy was subtle, yet effective. Tension and fatigue crept into the garrison, in ways more exhausting than physical attacks ever could. Outside the keep, the opposing forces maintained their distant presence, occasionally leaving signs of activity: a hastily built campfire, footprints along the riverbank, or discarded provisions that suggested a larger encampment than existed. The defenders debated endlessly whether to mount reconnaissance missions. Each sortie carried the dual risk of revealing weakness and exhausting already strained men. Those who ventured beyond the walls returned with ambiguous reports, signs of human activity, but never enough to confirm numbers or intent. Every decision required caution, patience, and a careful weighing of risk against necessity. Morale became the central battlefield. The unseen enemy understood that fear and anticipation could erode cohesion as effectively as swords or arrows. Sir Alaric observed subtle changes among his men: whispering in corners, tension during training, moments of hesitation when performing routine tasks. Even he felt the creeping doubt, questioning whether the absence of engagement signaled their superiority or whether disaster lurked just beyond sight. He began keeping meticulous notes, recording the weather, troop behavior, and minor incidents, all in an effort to find patterns and maintain control over what seemed uncontrollable. Villagers in nearby settlements added another layer to the siege. Rumors circulated that Dunholm Keep faced an overwhelming army poised for conquest. Traders arrived with caution, bringing supplies only under careful negotiation. Some refused entirely, leaving gaps that Sir Alaric had to compensate for through careful rationing and negotiation with locals. These indirect pressures amplified the sense of an impending crisis, reinforcing the psychological weight of the siege, even as physical danger remained minimal. Interestingly, the invisible nature of the siege forced innovation. Sir Alaric encouraged scouts to develop coded signals to communicate unseen threats, small flags or markers positioned where enemy movements might occur. Guards experimented with patrol patterns to avoid predictability. The keep's walls, originally designed for conventional defense, were used creatively. Lookouts were rotated more frequently, and false preparations were occasionally staged to observe enemy reactions from a distance. Each minor improvement, though unremarkable in isolation, contributed to an evolving understanding of strategy and human behavior under duress. Months passed, and the defenders' routines became almost ritualistic. Sleep was carefully divided into shifts. Meals occurred at precisely timed intervals. Every departure from the walls was noted and recorded. Sir Alaric's letters to neighbouring nobles and allies began describing the siege not as a physical confrontation, but as a prolonged test of discipline, observation, and patience. He reflected in writing that human endurance, not weapons, was the most critical factor in this engagement. By late summer, small incidents intensified the perceived siege. A sudden flood along the riverbank delayed local trade. A wild animal wandering into the outer courtyard triggered alarm. A misunderstanding during guard rotation created a brief moment of chaos. Each event, ordinary in isolation, became magnified through the lens of anticipation. The garrison, conditioned to interpret every anomaly as potential danger, experienced fatigue not just of body but of mind. This phase of the siege also revealed the importance of leadership under unseen pressure. Sir Alaric maintained calm, disciplined communication, and enforced routines that anchored the garrison in consistency. His personal example, meticulous attention to duty, careful observation, and a refusal to panic, prevented the invisible siege from unraveling the defenders' cohesion entirely. His writings suggest that he recognized the unique nature of this threat. It required not force or strategy alone, but psychological insight, endurance, and the capacity to maintain equilibrium under continuous ambiguous pressure. And here, as Section 2 concludes, you face a thought that lingers quietly. The siege of Dunholm Keep had no swords drawn, no walls breached, yet it reshaped lives, altered behavior, and tested resilience in ways more profound than many violent battles. Could it be that the most effective conflicts are sometimes invisible, fought not with force, but with attention, patience, and perception alone? As the months turned into a full year, the invisible siege of Dunholm Keep reached its quiet climax. The garrison, though fatigued by the persistent tension, had adapted remarkably. Guards moved with precision, meals were rationed to the exact hour, and patrols were executed with almost ritualistic regularity. The enemy's absence of direct engagement had forced Sir Alaric and his men to develop a discipline that was rarely required under conventional circumstances, a discipline that combined patience, observation, and psychological endurance. By early autumn, it became apparent that the opposing forces had achieved what their distant presence had intended. They had weakened the defenders' nerves without spilling a single drop of blood. Sir Alaric reflected on the peculiar nature of victory and defeat. Traditionally, a siege ended with walls breached or troops surrendered under force. Here, the challenge had been intangible, an exercise in human perception. The defenders had survived, yet they were changed, more attuned to subtlety, more careful with decisions, and more aware of the ways uncertainty shapes behavior. The villagers, initially fearful, had also adapted. They learned to observe patterns in the distant enemy movements, yet never faced direct confrontation themselves. Trade resumed in cautious increments. Local markets adjusted to delays in supply, and word of the invisible siege spread slowly beyond the immediate region. The story, preserved in letters, chronicles, and oral accounts, highlighted an unconventional understanding of power. Sometimes, restraint and psychological influence outweigh force. Sir Alaric, in private journals, noted that the most striking lesson was the power of perception. The mere possibility of threat had forced adaptations that were just as effective as any physical defense. By the time the enemy finally withdrew, whether due to reassignment, supply issues, or strategic relocation, Dunholm Keep had learned to defend itself against uncertainty as much as against any tangible force. The garrison emerged not only unscathed but sharpened in judgment, vigilance, and resilience. Historians centuries later would reflect on the invisible siege as an example of psychological warfare long before the term existed. It demonstrated how humans respond to continuous ambiguous pressure, and how routine, observation, and disciplined response can serve as armor against unseen challenges. The siege became a case study in endurance, a reminder that survival does not always depend on swords and walls, but on patience, adaptability, and the careful reading of circumstances. Interestingly, the invisible siege also influenced the design of small fortifications elsewhere. Scholars and military engineers noted the importance of observation, signaling, and adaptability over sheer force. Minor changes in patrol rotation, ration management, and communication protocols were informed by the lessons of Dunholm. In subtle ways, the quiet struggle of a small keep reshaped ideas about defense and human resilience in an era dominated by larger-scale warfare. Sir Alaric, who lived many years after the siege, often reflected on its peculiar nature. He realized that the greatest threats are sometimes those that are imagined or partially perceived. The unseen, the uncertain, and the subtle can demand more from human endurance than any direct assault. And he carried this lesson quietly through the rest of his life, sharing it in letters to trusted allies and embedding it in the oral teachings of future generations of garrison commanders. As you leave Dunholm Keep behind, with its towers standing silently and the river flowing gently below, you might consider a larger question. Are the conflicts we fear most those that are immediate and visible, or are they often the ones that exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, shaping behavior, thought, and character without ever needing to strike? You now enter a story that winds slowly through a quieter, more subtle facet of medieval life, the phenomenon of sound and perception within human dwellings. Greyford Manor, a sprawling estate on the edge of a low-lying moor, was built during the early 14th century. Its stone walls were thick, its halls long, and its towers numerous. The manor was not famous for battles or sieges, but for an unusual feature that would earn it a peculiar reputation over the decades. The walls themselves seemed to carry voices, not voices in the supernatural sense, yet not entirely explained by architecture either. The tale begins with Sir Edmund Greyford, a lord of middling influence whose family had owned the estate for generations. In the year 1420, Greyford Manor was home to a modest household. Servants who tended the kitchens and stables, guards who patrolled the outer walls, and family members who occupied the private chambers of the keep. Life was ordinary, punctuated by seasonal festivities, local governance, and occasional visits from neighboring nobility. Yet amidst this routine, a subtle anomaly emerged. It started in the northern wing, where the stone corridors were narrow and the ceilings high. Servants reported faint echoes of conversation, hushed tones that seemed to mimic words spoken elsewhere in the house. At first, these sounds were attributed to imagination or fatigue. Long hours of tending fires, cooking meals, or cleaning floors in drafty halls can play tricks on the ear. But as reports multiplied, Sir Edmund began to take notice. He instructed household members to observe carefully and record any unusual sounds, hoping that diligence might uncover a rational explanation. The phenomenon, you see, was peculiar. Conversations in one part of the manor often appeared to resonate in distant rooms, distorted yet intelligible. A whispered reprimand in the kitchen could seem to drift down the gallery toward the study. A discussion in the servants' hall occasionally echoed in the upper chambers, with syllables slightly altered, but the intent still recognizable. Architects and masons of the time had occasionally commented on acoustics in halls and churches, but nothing quite prepared them for the consistency and apparent intelligence of these echoes in Greyford Manor. Sir Edmund invited a few trusted guests to witness the phenomenon. On one evening, a visiting scribe recorded that he heard a conversation from the drawing room while seated in the west tower. The words were faint, like a breeze passing through stone, yet unmistakable. Another guest, a minor noblewoman, claimed that she could distinguish the conversations of servants in corridors she did not occupy, and that the voices seemed to carry emotional undertones as well: concern, urgency, amusement. No external source could explain the exact paths of sound. The manor's walls were examined for cracks or hollows that might amplify sound. Craftsmen tapped and struck stones, tested mortar, and explored hidden cavities. They found some irregularities, air pockets, and imperfectly joined stones, but nothing that accounted for the consistent echoes. Some surmised that the long, straight corridors functioned as conduits for low-frequency sounds. Others speculated that the thickness of the walls created a natural resonance chamber. Yet even with these considerations, the clarity and persistence of the whispering walls remained puzzling. Daily life at Greyford Manor began to adjust subtly. Servants learned to speak in softer tones, realizing that conversations could travel farther than expected. Lords and ladies became aware that confidential matters might not remain entirely private, and some began choosing locations for discussion with more care. The walls, silent as stone, had effectively become participants in household management, shaping human behavior without a single word of their own. Interestingly, the phenomenon also drew attention from scholars and clerics. Letters to distant monasteries described the manor's unusual acoustics, prompting visits from learned men interested in understanding how sound could behave in such a manner. Experiments were conducted, words spoken with varying intensity, sounds struck from metal or wood, and the resulting echoes mapped as carefully as possible. Even these detailed observations failed to produce a complete explanation. The whispering effect remained partly mysterious, a testament to the unpredictability of architecture, environment, and perception in combination. Some reports suggested psychological effects as well. Household members reported dreams in which the walls replayed conversations from the day, sometimes merging discussions from multiple rooms into single coherent sequences. Others claimed a sense of guidance or caution when moving through corridors, as if the manor's architecture subtly influenced behavior through sound alone. Though the effects were not dramatic, they accumulated over months and years, quietly shaping the lives of all who resided within Greyford's walls. And as this first section closes, you are left with a simple, yet intriguing thought. How much of our experience of space, of buildings, and of the environment is shaped not by what we see, but by what we hear, sometimes in ways that elude immediate explanation. In Greyford Manor, the ordinary act of living within stone walls became intertwined with perception, sound, and a subtle, persistent influence that no one could fully account for. The whispering phenomenon at Greyford Manor grew more pronounced as the years passed, affecting both the daily routines and the subtle psychology of its inhabitants. By the mid-40s, the household had largely adapted to the way sound seemed to move through walls, corridors, and staircases. Servants spoke in hushed tones not solely from etiquette, but from habit. Even mundane discussions carried farther than anticipated, traveling like secret currents along stone and timber. They began to recognize patterns, how certain rooms acted as conduits, how low tones traveled farther than high, and how voices could appear in unexpected spaces entirely. Sir Edmund, initially bemused, had become methodical in observing the manor's acoustics. He constructed a rudimentary map of the corridors, chambers, and staircases, marking spots where conversations carried most effectively. Meetings of household staff began to occur in designated rooms, carefully chosen to minimize or control echo. The Lord's private council convened in the upper tower, a space seemingly immune to the manor's strange resonance. These adaptations were practical, yet they also illustrated a growing awareness that the building itself was a participant in daily life, shaping decisions and behavior in subtle but meaningful ways. The whispering walls influenced more than mere conversation. Guards stationed along the battlements and corridors reported hearing movements and exchanges from distant rooms, allowing them to anticipate tasks or respond more quickly than before. Some historians suggest that this may have enhanced operational efficiency within the manor, though it came at a psychological cost. The constant awareness of unintended transmission of sound created a persistent vigilance among inhabitants, an almost perpetual state of attentiveness that required mental discipline. Scholars visiting the manor in this period conducted systematic experiments, attempting to quantify and explain the phenomenon. They struck metal plates and hollow vessels at specific points, measured echoes against distance, and even experimented with different types of wood and furnishings to observe changes in sound travel. These trials suggested that the combination of thick masonry, long corridors, and irregular stone alignment contributed to an unusual acoustic effect. Yet the clarity of the whispered conversations, sometimes spanning multiple rooms with remarkable fidelity, remained inexplicable. The manor's influence extended to social dynamics as well. Household members, aware that even whispered comments could be carried unintentionally, learned to exercise restraint in speech. Arguments, negotiations, and admonishments were tempered by the possibility of being overheard. This, in turn, fostered a peculiar form of self-regulation, where observation and anticipation replaced force or authority as the primary tools of household management. A subtle form of discipline emerged, mediated by the walls themselves rather than by human oversight alone. Psychologically, the effects were more pronounced over time. Children raised in Greyford Manor reportedly developed a heightened sensitivity to sound, capable of discerning conversations that outsiders might consider inaudible. Servants described an almost meditative awareness when moving through corridors, anticipating the echo patterns and adjusting their speech accordingly. Some individuals reported dreams in which multiple conversations merged into complex sequences, suggesting that the mind internalized and processed the auditory patterns of the manor, even during sleep. Despite these observations, no practical threat or danger accompanied the phenomenon. Unlike castles under siege or abbeys threatened by famine, Greyford Manor remained secure. The whispering walls, though mysterious and sometimes unsettling, offered lessons rather than peril, lessons in perception, discipline, and attention to the subtle ways in which environments influence behavior. Visitors who stayed for extended periods noted that living within the manor sharpened observation and patience, revealing connections between architecture, sound, and cognition that were otherwise unnoticed. By the late 1440s, the manor had become a site of quiet study for clerics, architects, and philosophers. Letters and marginal notes described the way the walls carried tones and syllables, often drawing analogies to moral lessons. Just as speech travels beyond intention, actions and choices ripple beyond immediate perception. The manor, through its unassuming stone corridors, became a living demonstration of cause and effect, subtle influence, and the interplay between human perception and physical environment. And so, as Section 2 concludes, you are left with a lingering thought. Could the whispering walls of Greyford Manor be teaching something deeper than mere acoustics? Perhaps they demonstrate that influence is not always visible, that guidance, correction, and observation can arise from structures themselves, and that human behavior is as responsive to subtle signals as it is to overt commands. In the quiet of stone corridors, ordinary life became intertwined with awareness in ways that would quietly endure for decades. By the late 1450s, Greyford Manor had become known across the region as a peculiar but instructive place. The whispering walls, once a source of minor curiosity, had firmly embedded themselves into the life and routines of the household. Servants and guards had adapted to the subtle echoes and channels of sound, and even family members had learned to measure words, tone, and pacing according to the manor's unique acoustics. What began as a mysterious curiosity had become a defining feature of daily life, influencing behavior in ways both subtle and profound. Sir Edmund, now older and more reflective, began to understand that the manor's walls were not simply conduits of sound, but instruments of human awareness. He observed that the ability to anticipate the path of sound improved patience, attention, and forethought. Household members acted with greater deliberation, choosing their words carefully and managing minor conflicts with consideration rather than impulse. The walls, in effect, became silent teachers, instilling restraint and mindfulness in anyone who spent significant time within them. Visitors continued to arrive, drawn by the legend of the whispering walls. Scholars and clerics brought measuring instruments, sketches, and notebooks, eager to map the movement of sound and determine its causes. Some conducted experiments with echoes, whispering words along corridors and staircases, and noting the distances traveled. The results suggested that the combination of long, narrow halls, irregular stone surfaces, and high vaulted ceilings created unusual resonance patterns. Yet these factors alone could not account for the precision and clarity with which certain conversations carried, leaving part of the phenomenon shrouded in mystery. The manor's influence extended beyond sound alone. Observers recorded that the anticipation of echoes subtly affected social dynamics. Servants became more cautious and attentive, families learned to resolve disagreements with discretion, and guards performed their duties with heightened alertness. In essence, Greyford Manor reshaped behavior through a combination of architecture and perception. Ordinary routines, meal preparation, laundry, and the tending of fires, were suffused with a quiet awareness of the environment, and this awareness in turn reinforced discipline and mindfulness. Even the manor's most subtle lessons left lasting impressions. Children raised within its corridors developed an acute sense of observation, sensitivity to nuance, and a capacity for patience that served them well in adulthood. Visitors noted that time seemed to flow differently within the house. Moments were measured not only by clocks or sunlight, but by the movement and echo of words. Daily life became an exercise in attentiveness, a continuous calibration of thought, speech, and action against the subtle cues of the environment. By the end of the 15th century, Greyford Manor had entered the annals of local history, not for battles or grand events, but for the quiet education its architecture provided. The whispering walls became a symbol of the ways in which ordinary structures can shape extraordinary awareness, teaching lessons in attention, restraint, and the influence of subtle forces on human behavior. Chroniclers recorded anecdotes, letters described experiences, and oral traditions carried stories of the manor's uncanny echoes for generations. In reflection, the whispering walls of Greyford Manor remind us that the ordinary often contains hidden instruction. Not all lessons arrive in dramatic forms. Some arrive in silence, in echoes, and in subtle cues that require patience, observation, and reflection. The manor's walls, though mute in intention, spoke volumes over decades, shaping the lives and minds of those who dwelled within. And here you are left with a thought that lingers. How much of the life you inhabit is shaped by subtle signals around you, by forces you may not consciously notice, and by ordinary structures that silently guide behavior? In Greyford Manor, the answer was carried not in bells, swords, or proclamations, but in whispers that traveled through stone, shaping human life in quiet but enduring ways.